The great malady of public life is cowardice. Most men are not untrue, but they are afraid. Most of the errors of public life, if my observation is to be trusted, come not because men are morally bad, but because they are afraid of somebody. God knows why they should be. It is generally shadows they are afraid of.
Those are the words of Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, and the subject of this, the 28th episode of the Dead Presidents Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Dead Presidents Podcast. We're talking Woodrow Wilson.
That's right.
And by we, I mean Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And James J. Hamilton.
That's right.
Your trusted co-hosts of the podcast. Back with another epic presidential life.
That's it. And this time, we're touching on the life of Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And it's always best to begin at the beginning, when Woodrow Wilson was forced from the womb on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. His grandparents were Scottish and Scots-Irish Presbyterians who immigrated to the U.S. from Ireland and England and settled in Ohio. His mother, Janet Woodrow, was born in England and moved to the U.S. at age 9. Her father was a Presbyterian preacher. While attending a girls' academy in Steubenville, Ohio, she met Joseph Wilson, son of a newspaper printer. Joseph was valedictorian of his class at Jefferson College in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which later merged with Washington College to become Washington and Jefferson College.
Which was almost attended by the Dead Presidents Podcast's own James J. Hamilton, until he opted instead for William McKinley's alma mater of Allegheny College.
There you have it.
Joseph Wilson would then attend Western Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh and Princeton Theological Seminary, and he was working as a teacher in Steubenville when he met Janet soon after their marriage. In 1849, he was ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and the family moved to Virginia, where he took over a church ministry. They had 2 daughters before adding a son whom they named after Janet's brother, Thomas Woodrow. The future president was called Tommy as a child.
That's right. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, known as Tommy.
A new fact right off the bat. You thought you knew Woodrow Wilson? That wasn't even his name.
That's right. Before he was 2, the family moved to Augusta, Georgia, where his father took over a different church and ran the Augusta Female Seminary. Wilson would later write, quote, "My earliest recollection is of standing at my father's gateway in Augusta, Georgia, when I was 4 years old, and hearing someone pass and say that Mr. Lincoln was elected, and there was to be a war." That's right. Woodrow Wilson, as a young man, remembered the moment when Abraham Lincoln said, "Don't diss my homies."
Yep, Wilson's earliest memory is that Abraham Lincoln was his enemy. An auspicious start for a eventual president.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, when the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church denounced secession as treason, Joseph Wilson helped found a new southern branch of the church, and he preached that slavery was divinely sanctioned. Later in the war, he converted his church into a military hospital, and Augusta narrowly avoided destruction during Sherman's march to the sea. A college friend would later recall that Woodrow Wilson was, quote, "very full of the South and quite secessionist. One night we sat up until dawn talking about the Civil War, he taking the Southern side and getting quite bitter about it."
Yeah. So here you go. The makings of a future quote-unquote historian. Wilson would also later write, quote, "It is all very well to talk of detachment of view and of the effort to be national in spirit and in purpose, but a boy never gets over his boyhood, and never can change those subtle influences which have become part of him, that were bred in him when he was a child. The only place in the country, the only place in the world, where nothing has to be explained to me, is the South."
Yeah, you think Woodrow Wilson, you think New Jersey, Princeton, But he's a Southerner at heart.
Yeah. He's also a frail and sensitive child, James. He idolizes his domineering father, who guides his early education and insists that he express himself clearly. Quote, "When you frame a sentence, don't do it as if you were loading a shotgun, but as if you were loading a rifle."
Good advice for precise speaking. Well, young Tommy, he organized the neighborhood boys into a baseball team and drafted a constitution to govern the team. When he was 13 years old, his family moved to Columbia, South Carolina, where his father became a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary. At 16, Tommy formally joined the Presbyterian Church, which he would describe as a turning point in his life. He wrote that, quote, "Christianity gave us in the fullness of time the perfect image of right living, the secret of social and of individual well-being." As president, he would read a chapter of the Bible every night, and he said, quote, "I am sorry for men who do not read the Bible every day. I wonder why they deprive themselves of the strength and pleasure."
That's it.
I think the same thing about men who don't listen to the Dead President's podcast every day.
Yeah, I concur. Young Wilson struggled with dyslexia as a child, and, this was kind of undiagnosed, but looking back later, they kind of realized, yeah, he was probably dyslexic. And he has a pretty difficult time reading and writing, but as a teenager, he's going to overcome his difficulties through nothing more than diligent effort. He develops perfect penmanship and he learns shorthand, becoming a proficient speedwriter. He also became a slow but avid reader, especially enjoying Sir Walter Scott and British history. He admired the British form of government and came to believe it was superior to the American. As a teenager, he said that Prime Minister William Gladstone was, quote, "the greatest statesman that ever lived. I intend to be a statesman too."
That's right. He fantasized about being a British admiral, a duke, and a knight of the garter, and he drafted a constitution for the fictional Royal United Kingdom Yacht Club. He would receive a classical education at a local school where his classmates included future Supreme Court Justice Joseph Lamar.
That's right. At age 16, Wilson enrolls at Davidson College, a Presbyterian school in Davidson, North Carolina. He gets good grades, but by the end of his freshman year, he is suffering from poor health and depression. He writes, quote, "I am now in my 17th year, and it is sad, when looking over my past life, to see how few of those 17 years I have spent in the fear of God, and how much I have spent in the service of the devil."
Our listeners are learning a lot. Woodrow Wilson, his actual name was Tommy, and he was a devil worshiper. Self-described.
Self-confessed worshiper of Satan.
Well, he left Davidson College after just 1 year and transferred to the College of New Jersey at Princeton after having met the college's president, a minister who knew his father. And Wilson would love Princeton. He excelled in his classes, he made a small group of close friends, and he was involved in many student organizations. He joined the American Whig Society, a literary and debate club whose past members included Princeton alumni James Madison and Aaron Burr.
That's it.
He became a dedicated debater, some might say a master debater.
Indeed.
But he felt that the traditional debating contests emphasized theatrical performance over persuasion, and so he formed his own society, the Liberal Debating Club, and of course, he drafted its constitution.
That's right. He's also going to become an editor of the college newspaper and secretary of the Football Association. He had his first experience in politics when he set his sights on becoming president of the Baseball Association. He wrote a long editorial arguing that the baseball team needed a president who was, quote, "a man of unbiased judgment, energy, determination, intelligence, moral courage, conscience." When another student was set to be elected, his friends engineered a postponement in the vote, and Wilson was elected at the next meeting. The Princeton baseball team had a losing record in both seasons of Wilson's 2-year presidency. Well,
at least he was a man of unbiased judgment.
yes.
In college, Wilson created a business card for himself reflecting his future ambitions that read, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, Senator from Virginia. He also continued his admiration for the British Constitution, writing an essay arguing that the American government should adopt a more parliamentary character, with cabinet members sitting in Congress and the executive and legislative branches working more closely together. He submitted the essay to the political journal International Review, where it was accepted for publication by a junior editor who was also Wilson's future arch-nemesis, Henry Cabot Lodge.
That's right, and we'll get a little bit more into Henry Cabot Lodge later on. As a senior, Wilson withdrew from an opportunity to participate in a prestigious debate event at graduation when he learned that he had been assigned to argue against the abolition of universal suffrage. Wilson had previously noted in his diary that, quote, universal suffrage is at the foundation of every evil in this country. His decision to withdraw was supported by his father, who believed that, quote, Negroes and, quote, ignorant Northern voters shouldn't be allowed to vote. In 1879, he graduated in the top third of his class, won a literary prize for an essay on Prime Minister William Pitt, and was named his class's, quote, model statesman.
That's right. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, on his way to becoming a senator from Virginia, at least in his own mind. And speaking of Virginia, after leaving Princeton, he's going to enroll in law school at the University of Virginia. He explained his decision by saying, quote, the profession I chose was politics. The profession I entered was the law. I entered the one because I thought it would lead to the other. Wilson soon made a name for himself as a public speaker and debater. In one speech, he said, quote, I yield to no one precedence in love for the South, but because I love the South, I rejoice in the failure of the Confederacy. The perpetuation of slavery would, beyond all question, have wrecked our agricultural and commercial interests, at the same time that it supplied a fruitful source of irritation abroad and agitation within. We cannot conceal from ourselves the fact that slavery was enervating our Southern society and exhausting to Southern energies.
There you go.
Slavery was wrong because it was bad for Southern whites and because other people would be complaining about it.
Yeah. So, Wilson is going to start going by T. Woodrow Wilson, considering Tommy to be a childish name. At law school, Wilson first showed interest in the feta sex, writing to a friend, quote, I'm reserving all my powers of charming for the Virginia girls. He often visited the family of his namesake uncle, Thomas Woodrow, who lived in nearby Staunton, Virginia, Wilson's birthplace. His reason for spending so much time there was that he had fallen hopelessly in love with his first cousin, Harriet Woodrow.
That's right. After poor health forced him to withdraw from law school, he told Harriet that he loved her and asked her to marry him. She responded that she, quote, loved him dearly as a cousin, but that it would not be right for them to marry because they were cousins.
Yeah.
He said that he had obtained the blessing of both of their parents, but she remained steadfast in her rejection. Wilson then moved to Atlanta, where a law school classmate offered to form a partnership. He was admitted to the Georgia bar, but he had little interest in practicing law. He spent his time composing political articles and waiting for clients that never came.
That's pretty much it. Outside of settling his mother's interest in an uncle's estate, he did virtually no legal business. He collected only a few paltry legal fees, never appeared in court, and never filed a lawsuit. He would eventually give up the law when he was accepted for a fellowship in graduate studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore.
Well, he was still fantasizing about a political career, but he decided to seek a job as a professor, which he considered the only career in which he could make money while also pursuing his intellectual interests in history and political science. Johns Hopkins was founded on the German method of university education, in which students shared their own writings and ideas for discussion rather than listening to professors lecture. Wilson would begin preparing a book-length treatise on American government, and he got permission to focus on his independent work rather than the traditional curriculum. He successfully solicited a publisher for the resulting book, Congressional Government, A Study in American Politics.
And I'm sure if you want to waste your time, you could still read that today. Wilson believed that Congress should spend more time debating broad ideals and less time in committees working on policy details. He decried what he saw as Congress's preeminence over the president, arguing that, quote, the prestige of the presidential office has declined with the character of the presidents, and the character of the presidents has declined as the perfection of selfish party tactics has advanced.
A Wilson biographer described the book as, quote, largely a collage of other people's ideas, but it received excellent reviews upon its publication in 1885, with one reviewer calling it, quote, the best critical writing on the American Constitution which has appeared since the Federalist Papers.
Wow.
Pretty high praise.
Jesus.
Wilson accepted a teaching position and left Johns Hopkins without completing the requirements for his degree, but in 1886 he got special consideration from his former professor, who accepted congressional government as Wilson's dissertation, and after he passed an oral exam he received his Ph.D.
There it is.
Now we've got Dr. Wilson.
And Dr. Wilson is about to write a prescription for himself. Prescription for love.
That's right, because in addition to embarking on his academic career, he's also entering married life. In 1883, he was in Rome, Georgia, settling his uncle's estate when he met Ellen Axon, daughter of a Presbyterian minister who happened to be friends with Wilson's father. When Ellen's mother died in childbirth, she became a mother figure to her younger siblings and also took care of her father. She studied at Rome Female College and was a gifted painter. When she was 18, her paintings won a bronze medal at the Paris International Exposition.
Pretty impressive. Now, Ellen finds Wilson to be, quote, a fine-looking man, and he was enchanted by her, quote, bright, pretty face and her, quote, splendid, mischievous, laughing eyes. They began a courtship through letters and Wilson's frequent visits to Rome. In September 1883, each happened to be passing through Asheville, North Carolina, when they randomly bumped into each other at a Fish concert.
Well, actually, it wasn't at a Fish concert, but they each took the chance meeting to be a sign of divine providence, and Wilson asked Ellen to marry him, and she said yes. They agreed to wait until he completed his graduate studies before getting married. In the meantime, Ellen's father was confined to a mental institution where he committed suicide.
Ouch.
She would then go on to attend art school in Manhattan, and after Wilson obtained a teaching position, he and Ellen were married in 1885 at her grandfather's home in Georgia, and over the next 4 years, they would have 3 daughters.
That's it. After their wedding, the Wilsons moved to Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, where he had signed a 2-year contract to teach at Bryn Mawr College, a brand new, all-female institution. Ellen had questioned whether there was any reputation to be gained at a female college, and Wilson assured her that he would rather teach men, but without any experience and not yet having his Ph.D., it was the best job he could get. He confided to Ellen that he still dreamed, quote, to take an active, if possible a leading part in public life and strike out for myself, if I had the ability, a statesman's career.
At Bryn Mawr, he taught history, politics, and economics. One student recalled that he, quote, always entered the classroom smiling and animated and always in a good humor. His lectures were fascinating and held me spellbound. Each was an almost perfect little essay in itself, well-rounded and with a distinct literary style. Bryn Mawr was one of the first female schools to offer graduate studies, and Wilson worked closely with graduate fellows. One was an abolitionist minister's daughter from Massachusetts who found Wilson to be patronizing and recalled that it was a new experience for her, quote, to meet a Southerner who had no special sympathy for Negroes as human beings.
Oof.
Wilson soon grew disenchanted with Bryn Mawr, venting in a letter to Ellen, quote, I'm tired of carrying female fellows on my shoulders. When I think of you, my little wife, I love this college for women because you are a woman. But when I think of only of myself, I hate the place very cordially.
Boy. Ellen finds her husband possessed by, quote, extreme personal ambition. He applies for a position as Assistant Secretary of State, though his application is ignored. But other universities are interested in him, and even though he had renewed his Bryn Mawr contract, he looked for a way out of it. The renewed contract provided that he should have an assistant, quote, as soon as practicable. And when he did not get an assistant after a year, he claimed the college was in breach. Though the college believed the law was on its side, it agreed to let him go. In 1888, he accepted a professorship at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, where he taught history and political science. In a course on the U.S. Constitution, he taught that the Constitution was, quote, not merely a document written down on paper, but is a living and organic thing which, like all living organisms, grows and adapts itself to the circumstances of its environment.
Well, Wilson would also argue that, quote, in the matter of secession, the South was absolutely right from the point of view of a lawyer, though quite wrong from the point of view of a statesman. He joined the advisory board for the Wesleyan football team and served as a coach. The Wesleyan team was 2-7 that year and lost one game to Yale by a score of 105-0.
Oof.
In 1889, he published another book, The State, Elements of Historical and Practical Politics, a history of government from ancient times to the present, which would be used as a textbook in many colleges. After a year and a half at Wesleyan, Wilson's friends succeeded in lobbying on his behalf at his alma mater, Princeton, which offered him the chair of jurisprudence and political economy.
That's it. Wilson quickly becomes the most popular lecturer at Princeton, with the school moving his lectures to the chapel to accommodate the hundreds of students he drew. One student stated, quote, I consider Wilson the greatest classroom lecturer I have ever heard. Wilson is also going to get involved in many student activities, coaching debate, refereeing track and field events, coaching the football team, and more.
To be fair, I don't know which years Wilson was involved with the football team, but the Princeton football team was dominant throughout the entire 1890s.
Yeah, there you have it. He's also going to join every faculty committee and begin exerting influence on the administration of the college. To address the problem of cheating, he successfully proposed that students take an honor pledge and that violators be judged by a student committee rather than by faculty members. You know, this is an early form of the peer jury program that some of us may remember and some of us may have been on.
Yeah? Well, Wilson has had some influential ideas in education. He was also, at this time, a doting father and enjoyed playing with his daughters. He was also a devoted husband who wrote Ellen long love letters whenever he was out of town. Quote, "I am madly in love with you. I live upon your love, and would die if I could not win and hold your admiration. Are you prepared for the storm of lovemaking with which you will be assailed?"
There you have it. Wilson feeling randy. And in 1893, he publishes Division and Reunion, a history of the United States from 1829 to 1889. He also writes a 5-volume history of the American people, published in 1902. Though Wilson claimed to write history with, quote, impartiality of judgment, his racist pro-Southern views pervade his works, especially his discussion of Reconstruction. Quote, "The policy of the congressional leaders wrought a veritable overthrow of civilization in the South, in their determination to put the white South under the heel of the black South. Adventurers swarmed out of the North, as much the enemies of one race as of the other, to cozen, beguile, and use the Negroes. In the villages, the Negroes were the office holders, men who knew none of the uses of authority except its insolences. The white men of the South were aroused by the mere instinct of self-preservation to rid themselves, by fair means or foul, of the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes and conducted in the interest of adventurers, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country." Woof.
There's Woodrow Wilson, Princeton professor, historian.
Yeah.
In 1896, Wilson consulted a doctor after his hand froze and his fingers became numb while he was writing. He likely suffered, undiagnosed, a small stroke, but he ignored doctor's orders to rest. He was a pretty hot commodity at the time academically. Many other universities were inquiring about his availability. Princeton was afraid of losing him, gave him a substantial raise. He would give a major address at the school's 150th anniversary, at which time its name was changed from the College of New Jersey to Princeton University. A major expansion was in the works, with plans for a graduate school and a law school, but the plans floundered under the lackluster administration of University President Francis Patton. In June 1902, the Board of Trustees secured Patton's resignation and voted unanimously that its next president would be Woodrow Wilson.
So Woodrow Wilson is about to become president of Princeton.
We'll find out how he takes to it right after these words from our sponsors. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Clifford Titus, who publishes this important message. My wife, Bella Sprague Titus, having left my bed and board, I will not be responsible for any debts contracted by her. Listeners, every man needs a good wife, and a good man like Clifford Titus certainly deserves better treatment than what he's getting from Bella Titus, who has shamefully abdicated her wifely duties for no apparent reason. What could she possibly have to say in defense of her reprehensible conduct?
Perhaps we'll soon find out, because Bella Titus has just bought an ad on our show and wishes to publish this no-holds-barred response. After my husband, Clifford Titus, a collector on the Long Island Railroad, spent his evenings away from home and paid his attentions to other women, then choked and abused me and ordered me from my home, I found it time to leave his bed and board. There you have it, listeners. Our sponsor, Clifford Titus, has been unmasked as an unprincipled womanizer and villainous woman strangler. We retract our earlier ad and encourage you to generously lend money to Bella Titus on her husband's account. If only there were some more severe sanction than being publicly shamed before the worldwide audience of the Dead Presidents podcast.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. Clifford Titus, who recently advertised his wife Bella Sprague Titus as having left his bed and board, saying he would no longer be responsible for any debts contracted by her in his name, was arrested today by Detective Dennis Killane of the Jamaica Precinct on a charge of abandonment brought by his wife. Mrs. Titus, who is staying at present with relatives at Far Rockaway, swore out a warrant for her husband's arrest. She says she wants an allowance from her husband for the support of their child, a little girl about 6 years old. Magistrate Harry Miller will hear the case in the Jamaica Police Court. Listeners, we can finally rest assured that Clifford Titus will receive his just deserts, and Bella and her little girl will be well provided for.
This just in, we have another breaking news update. After hearing the evidence, Magistrate Harry Miller has decided that Bella Titus voluntarily left her husband with her young daughter and that she could not, therefore, have been abandoned. Listeners, perhaps there's more to this story than meets the eye, and we have no choice but to accept the impartial judgment of Magistrate Harry Miller, which leaves Bella Titus destitute and Clifford Titus free to spend his money on other women. If you acted on our earlier encouragement and lent money to Bella on the hope that Clifford would have to pay you back, you are plumb out of luck. She now likely owes huge sums to our listenership. She'll have to get a job, and we hope that child labor has not yet been totally outlawed, so her 6-year-old daughter can pitch in as well.
Well, this next ad is very timely under the circumstances. We're proud to be sponsored by debt collector Harry W. Warsham, who operates on a simple motto: I'll get the dough whether they have it or not. Harry W. Warsham gives prompt attention to all bills and accounts placed into his hands for collection. Offices at the Bixby Bank Building, hours 9 a.m. to noon and 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Listeners, does some single mother owe you money? Does she keep saying she can't pay you back right now, that she needs her last few pennies to keep her kid alive? Harry W. Warsham won't be deterred by horseshit excuses like that. He's heard every sob story in the book, and tears have no effect on him. He'll get your money by any means necessary. That's a message from our sponsor, Harry W. Warsham.
And now, back to the show.
And we're back with episode 13 of the Dead Princeton Presidents podcast, talking about Woodrow Wilson, who of course became the 13th president in Princeton's history and the first who was not a Presbyterian minister.
Ooh.
His inauguration was attended by former President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, who is now a Princeton resident and university trustee, as well as J.P. Morgan, Mark Twain, Robert Todd Lincoln, New Jersey Governor Franklin Murphy, and many other dignitaries.
Wow.
Quite an event.
Indeed.
In his first board meeting as president, Wilson unveiled an ambitious reform agenda, including a graduate school, a law school, a school of electrical engineering, a museum of natural history, expanded history, economics, and biology departments, new dormitories and dining halls, and 50 new assistant faculty members to be called preceptors who would work closely with students. He also proposed having upperclassmen choose to concentrate in particular fields of study, a plan that developed into an enduring nationwide model and is familiar today as every college student has to choose their major.
That's right.
You can thank Woodrow Wilson for your major.
That's it. Wilson's proposals would cost $12.5 million, and the university's endowment was below $4 million. So he embarked on a nationwide campaign of giving speeches and making appeals to groups of Princeton alumni and wealthy benefactors like Andrew Carnegie, who made a large donation. Wilson raised expectations for students, saying, quote, "I am not going to propose that we compel the undergraduates to work all the time, but I am going to propose that we make the undergraduates want to work all the time." Many underperforming students were let go. Wilson also made the faculty work harder and make their courses more rigorous. Princeton garnered much national attention, and Wilson received many speaking invitations. In 1905, the annual Army-Navy football game was held at Princeton, and Wilson spent the day with President Theodore Roosevelt and joined him in the president's tradition of walking across the field at halftime so as to spend equal time in the Army and Navy bleachers. In 1906, Wilson attended a tribute dinner held for him at a New York private club where George Harvey, a wealthy businessman and publisher who was an influential Democratic Party kingmaker, praised Wilson by saying he was the, quote, "type of man that we shall soon, if indeed we do not already, need in public life." As one of a considerable number of Democrats who have become tired of voting Republican tickets, it is with a sense of almost rapture I contemplate even the remotest possibility of casting a ballot for the president of Princeton University to become president of the United States.
Wow. Woodrow Wilson making some waves.
Indeed.
Well, that same year, in 1906, Wilson is likely suffering another stroke, and when he suddenly could not see out of his left eye, doctors believed as the result of a blood clot, and he was diagnosed with hardening arteries. This time he abided by doctors' advice to rest, and Ellen would thereafter entirely devote herself to keeping things calm and quiet for him. During his tenure at Princeton, the unofficially Presbyterian University announced its non-sectarian status and became more heavily populated by other Protestant denominations and even a few Catholics and Jews. The one Jewish student described the, quote, "cold contempt and icy prejudice" that his co-religionist faced on campus.
That's a shame.
Speaking of shames.
Yeah, long known for its high enrollment by Southerners, Princeton did not extend its welcome to African Americans. Wilson said, quote, "While there is nothing in the law of the university to prevent a Negro's entering, the whole temper and tradition of the place are such that no Negro has ever applied for admission, and it seems extremely unlikely that the question will ever assume a practical form." End quote. Ugh. When a man of color wrote a letter requesting admission, Wilson responded that it was, quote, "altogether inadvisable for a colored man to enter Princeton," and recommended other schools. Ugh. Despite his national reputation, Wilson is going to lose two major battles in the latter years of his Princeton presidency. He planned to dismantle the school's country club atmosphere in which wealthy students banded together in exclusive eating clubs and high-class living quarters. Wilson proposed to abolish these clubs and have all students live and eat together in new residential quadrangles, which he envisioned as a utopian intellectual community where the wealthy would mingle as equals with the non-privileged students, as Wilson himself had once been.
Well, the trustees approved the plan, but it faced major backlash from alumni who felt that Wilson was, quote, "killing the spirit of Princeton." The trustees then went against Wilson and voted to table the plan pending further investigation when Jack Hibben, who was Wilson's closest friend and ally among the faculty, sided with the opposition. Wilson took it as a personal betrayal and ended their friendship. Wilson's other major battle was over the proposed graduate school. Professor Andrew West had been named the prospective graduate school's dean, and he submitted a plan to locate the graduate school on the outskirts of campus. Wilson wanted it built in the heart of campus, where undergraduates could interact with graduate scholars, and where Wilson could keep a close eye on it, rather than having it become West's personal fiefdom. Wilson and West each courted major donors to offer funding contingent on their preferred location, and in the end, West outmaneuvered Wilson when a wealthy benefactor's will left $10 million for the Princeton Graduate School and put West in charge of how to dispense the funds.
Ooh.
Wilson conceded defeat on the issue, but by that time, he was preparing to leave Princeton for his long-held dream of becoming a statesman.
That's just it. Publishing magnate George Harvey was serious about making Wilson president. In 1910, Harvey secured the support of James Smith, a former U.S. Senator and New Jersey's Democratic Party machine boss, to nominate Wilson for governor of New Jersey. Smith believed the inexperienced Wilson would be his puppet and would have to rely on the machine to run the government. Wilson said he would accept the gubernatorial nomination only, quote, if it came to me unsought, unanimously, and without pledges to anybody about anything. It was the height of the progressive era, and progressive reformers in the Democratic Party were enthusiastic about Wilson. With support from progressives and the Smith machine, Wilson was handed the nomination on a silver platter, and many were already talking about him being the next president of the United States. A pretty meteoric rise. Wilson is going to embark on a speaking tour of the state, and he turns out to be an engaging political orator. When a third-party candidate challenged him as being a machine candidate, Wilson issued stinging rebuke of the machine, declaring, quote, I should deem myself forever disgraced should I even in the slightest degree cooperate in any such system or any such transactions as you describe in your characterization of the boss system. Wilson is going to go on to win the election with 54% of the vote, and Democrats win control of the state legislature as well as the U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, party machine boss Smith then suddenly decided that he would like to return to the U.S. Senate, even though New Jersey Democrats had previously nominated another candidate. Wilson came out in opposition to Smith's candidacy and helped engineer his defeat, and the state legislature elected the original Democratic nominee to the Senate.
There you have it.
Wilson taking machine support to get the nomination and then turning around and sticking a dagger into the gut of the machine boss.
That's it.
Pretty smart political move.
Yeah, he's throwing a spanner in the works of the machine.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed.
Well, he's going to be governor now. Wilson asks former state representative Joseph Tumulty to serve as his personal secretary and political advisor, and Tumulty would remain Wilson's loyal right-hand man for the rest of his political career. Upon taking office in January 1911, with the cooperation of a friendly, progressive-leaning legislature, Wilson is going to quickly sign into law a series of progressive reforms, including regulation of public utilities, an Employers' Liability Act, an elections bill providing for direct primaries, and regulation of corrupt practices.
Wilson's unofficial presidential campaign was already underway, and he embarked on a speaking tour of the western states that generated a lot of enthusiasm. The New York Times opined, quote, it is easier to nominate a Democrat who deserves to win than to nominate one who is able to win. We must seek a leader in whom these two qualities are united. I believe that Mr. Wilson meets both requirements. Now, when William Jennings Bryan, the radical populist who was the Democratic Party's unsuccessful presidential nominee in 1896, 1900, and 1908, gave a speech at Princeton, Ellen arranged for the Wilsons to have dinner with Bryan, and Wilson earned Bryan's blessing. By January 1912, 1 year into Wilson's governorship, Republicans recaptured the New Jersey state legislature. Wilson would sign into law food standards regulation, education reform, a child labor law, a city planning commission, and an immigration commission. But he would also veto more than 40 bills as the New Jersey government descended into gridlock. He spent more time out of state as the presidential election grew nearer.
That's right. 1912 is going to see the first major appearance of presidential primary elections, which were held in about a third of the states. Wilson had mixed results in the primaries, winning fewer delegates than House Speaker Champ Clark of Missouri, but finishing well ahead of House Majority Leader Oscar Underwood of Alabama and Ohio Governor Judson Harmon. The nomination remained wide open at the Democratic National Convention in Baltimore in June, where a two-thirds majority of the delegates is required to win.
That's right. The results of the first ballot were Clark 440, Wilson 324, Harmon 148, Underwood 117. The convention deadlocked, with Clark remaining in first place for 29 ballots. Clark gained a majority of the delegates on the 10th ballot when New York's Tammany Hall machine threw its support behind him, but support from the notorious Tammany Hall prompted William Jennings Bryan to turn against Clark and support Wilson. Wilson will steadily gain support, and he moves into first place on the 30th ballot. Indiana is going to switch to Wilson on the 42nd ballot, and then, on the 46th ballot, the tide breaks in his favor, and he wins the nomination. The vice presidential nomination goes to Indiana Governor Thomas Marshall, whom Wilson considered, quote, a small caliber man. Ouch. Without Wilson's knowledge, his advisors had offered the vice presidential nomination to Marshall in exchange for Indiana's delegates.
Well, Wilson getting the nomination with the help of that small caliber bullet fired from Indiana.
Indeed.
And now we're getting into the general election of 1912, which we've already discussed extensively in episodes 26 and 27. This election, the clash of three presidents.
That's it.
And Wilson facing a hopelessly fractured Republican Party, with ex-President Theodore Roosevelt challenging his chosen successor, incumbent President William Howard Taft, for the Republican nomination. And after Taft won the nomination at a bitterly contested convention, Roosevelt bolted the party and accepted the nomination of the third party, Progressive Party, a.k.a. the Bull Moose Party.
That's just it. Now, while Taft quietly campaigned on maintaining judicial independence and adherence to the Constitution, Roosevelt touted his aggressively progressive new nationalism platform. Wilson's own progressive platform was branded as the New Freedom. It called for lower tariffs, banking reform, and regulation of big business. For advice on economic issues, Wilson turned to Louis Brandeis, the Jewish progressive activist known as the People's Lawyer. With Brandeis's help, Wilson crafted proposals to regulate competition and break up monopolistic trusts, an approach that contrasted with Roosevelt's preference for increased regulation of big trusts by big government. Wilson is going to argue that, quote, what this country needs above everything else is a body of laws which will look after men who are on the make rather than the men who are already made.
Wilson's campaign is pretty much going to ignore Taft and focus on Roosevelt as his main rival. Wilson privately analyzed his differences with Roosevelt, saying, quote, he appeals to their imagination, I do not. He is a real, vivid person whom they have seen and shouted themselves hoarse over and voted for millions strong. I am a vague, conjectural personality, more made up of opinions and academic prepossessions than of human traits and red corpuscles. But Wilson is going to transcend this humble opinion of himself and pretty effectively connect with voters, giving speeches that were extemporaneous yet perfectly formed with articulate, poetic language. In one speech he said, quote, "The pygmy hasn't any chance in America, only the giant has. What I am interested in is laws that will give the little man a chance to show these fellows that he has brains enough to compete with them and can presently make his local market a national market and his national market a world market."
Wilson said little on the subject of race relations, though he told an African-American delegation, quote, "I was born and raised in the South. There is no place where it is easier to cement friendship between the two races than there. You may feel assured of my entire comprehension of the ambitions of the Negro race and my willingness and desire to deal with that race fairly and justly." With African Americans feeling neglected by Republicans and Roosevelt's progressives, Wilson would win more black votes than any previous Democratic candidate. He also benefited from a perception whereby Northerners considered him a Northerner, while Southerners saw him as one of their own. When Roosevelt was shot on October 14th, Wilson suspended his campaigning until Roosevelt was back in action. Kind of a noble move.
I think they also privately knew that Roosevelt would be infuriated by him doing that.
Yeah.
Because it makes Roosevelt look weak.
Yeah. So maybe in a way a subtle dig.
Well, on Election Day, it's really the Republican Party schism that is the deciding factor when Wilson wins an electoral college landslide of 435 electoral votes against 88 for Roosevelt and 8 for Taft. Wilson won 40 states, Roosevelt winning 6 and Taft just 2. However, Wilson won only 42% of the popular vote, against 27% for Roosevelt, 23% for Taft, and 6% for Socialist Party candidate Eugene V. Debs. Wilson had the lowest popular vote total of any successful presidential candidate since Lincoln's 40% in 1860.
There you have
which
it.
is, of course, Wilson's earliest memory.
Yeah.
And despite winning 40 states, Wilson got over 50% of the vote in only 11 states, all in the former Confederate South.
That's right. Woodrow Wilson, the first Southerner to win the presidency since Zachary Taylor in 1848, and the only former Confederate citizen to serve as president. Democrats would also gain 4 Senate seats, capturing a narrow majority, and 62 House seats, increasing their majority to more than double the seats held by Republicans.
So Woodrow Wilson going to Washington with a Democratic Congress.
Indeed. Could be groundbreaking. We'll find out whether or not it is when we come back from these words from our sponsors.
The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by the Ewing Hotel, which has an exciting opportunity for our listeners. Wanted, good, experienced chambermaids. Apply at the Ewing Hotel, 804 4th Street. Listeners, if you have even a smidgen of chambermaiding experience under your belt, you could soon find yourself in the enviable position of working for a top-notch establishment like the Ewing Hotel. The Ewing Hotel is a paragon of class and sophistication, and by joining its elite staff, you will move in the highest circles of polite society.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. The Ewing Hotel has been searched by police and 7 people have been arrested, including Mrs. May Talbot, who has been charged with running a house of prostitution. Marie Taylor, a laundry girl, was charged with vagrancy. 3 men were fined for disturbing the peace, and 2 others were charged with the illegal sale of intoxicating liquor. Listeners, these charges are baseless and will undoubtedly be dismissed forthwith. The Ewing Hotel's offer stands. If you have the experience to ply your trade as a chambermaid,
Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more.
head on down to the Ewing Hotel and see Madame Talbot, who is always on the lookout for working girls who know how to take care of business in the bedroom, by which, of course, we mean making the beds. That's a message from our sponsor, the Ewing Hotel.
We're also proud to be sponsored by the A.G. Barnes Circus. Ladies and gentlemen, the A.G. Barnes Circus is coming to town in all its awe-inspiring ponderousness, its kaleidoscopic radiance, and its spirited revelation. Young and old flock from miles around to see its multitudinous attractions. Clowns, dancers, equestrians, trained dogs, trained monkeys, and trained pigs who prove the falsity of the theory you can't train a pig. The A.G. Barnes Circus has 110 different wild animals, including elephants, zebra, seals, panthers, and leopards, not to mention lions, tigers, and bears.
Oh, my!
The show starts at 8 o'clock, with the doors opening at 7 to give the public an hour to see the vast menagerie. Listeners, the circus is the great American national amusement, and A.G. Barnes is the best in the business. He's constantly adding new features, new creatures, and new sensations for the circus-loving public. You simply cannot miss this show. It is guaranteed to bring forth gales of laughter from kiddies and grown-ups alike. The A.G. Barnes Circus is good, wholesome fun for the whole family. That's a message from our sponsor, the A.G. Barnes Circus.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. 6 members of the A.G. Barnes Circus have been arrested and charged with staging a lewd performance. The charges stem from the allegedly immoral nature of the dances given in a sideshow conducted, quote, for men only. Among those arrested were 3 female dancers and 3 male circus managers. Law enforcement officials took in the show before making the arrests, with one officer describing the performance as, quote, lewd, crude, rude, and almost nude. Another officer said, quote, I've seen worse, and I really enjoyed it, but don't quote me on that, end quote. Listeners, when we said the A.G. Barnes Circus was fun for the whole family, we meant it. Circuses are well known for appealing to children, but the A.G. Barnes Circus doesn't forget about the dads. Its for-men-only sideshow is so entertaining that it's practically illegal, and it has received glowing reviews from most of the arresting officers. But don't worry, the arrested dancers have forfeited their bail and skipped out on their scheduled court appearance, so you can rest assured that they will be there when you see the show tonight. That's a message from our sponsor, the A.G. Barnes Circus.
And now, back to the show. And we're back, ready to go with Woodrow Wilson as he embarks as President of the United States, taking office on March 4th, 1913. His inaugural address proposed progressive reforms without mentioning foreign policy and was full of soaring rhetoric. Quote, the high enterprise of the new day is to lift everything that concerns our life as a nation to the light that shines from the hearth fire of every man's conscience and vision of the right. It is inconceivable that we should do this as partisans. The feelings with which we face this new age sweep across our heartstrings like some air out of God's own presence, where justice and mercy are reconciled and the judge and brother are one. Wilson considered the inaugural ball an unnecessary expense and canceled it, ending the tradition of the official inaugural ball until it was revived by Harry Truman in 1949. Instead, Wilson attended a dinner held by the Princeton class of 1879.
Interesting stuff. And that's going to bring us to, of course, appointments. Wilson's got to get a cabinet together. For Secretary of State, Wilson is going to name William Jennings Bryan, who lacked foreign policy experience but had traveled the world extensively over the previous decade. Bryan was a staunch anti-imperialist who favored submitting all international disputes to arbitration. He was also a teetotaler and received Wilson's blessing to serve no alcohol at diplomatic dinners. William G. McAdoo, a railroad executive who had served as vice chairman of the Democratic National Committee, was named Treasury Secretary. The 50-year-old McAdoo was recently widowed and had 6 children, but in May 1914, he married Wilson's 23-year-old daughter, Eleanor, in a White House wedding, making him #1 on our list of top 5 cradle-robbing Treasury Secretaries.
Also, perhaps #1 on nepotism Treasury Secretaries. Although when he asked Wilson for his blessing to marry his daughter, he offered to resign from the cabinet. Wilson insisted that he stay, although he also noted that if you had already been married to my daughter, I couldn't have named you Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
We got Texas Congressman Albert Burleson named Postmaster General. He would become one of the most influential and infamous holders of that office in American history. So you'll find out why as we continue the episode.
Indeed.
You also have Lindley Garrison, a New Jersey lawyer with no military experience, becoming war secretary. The cabinet contained a majority of Southerners, with one biographer calling it, quote, mostly a team of rebels, lawyers from the South who had pursued other professions and never shed their Confederate biases. Anglo-Saxon Protestants, all mostly newcomers to Washington, if not politics altogether.
That's it. Wilson's closest advisor was Colonel Edward House. The title was honorific. He had no military experience. House was a wealthy businessman and backroom political operator from Texas who was Wilson's top campaign advisor. After naming Bryan as Secretary of State, Wilson offered House his choice of any other cabinet post, but House declined an official position and wielded great influence as an unofficial advisor on a wide range of issues, and had unrestricted direct access to the president, who said, quote, Mr. House is my second personality.
Wow. You got Joseph Tumblety becoming Wilson's personal secretary, a post akin to the modern position of White House Chief of Staff. And another major player in the Wilson administration, when Wilson fell ill during his first week in office with a severe headache and gastric disorder, Navy Dr. Cary Grayson advised that he was over-medicating his headaches with substances that upset his stomach and took him off the drugs, and impressed Wilson, named Dr. Grayson his personal physician, and Grayson would become a close friend and a key advisor.
That's right. Wilson also appointed several wealthy political supporters as ambassadors of major European powers despite their lack of diplomatic experience, believing the positions were not critical given that the world was at peace. Upon taking office, Wilson told a friend, quote, It would be the irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. We'll see if the irony of fate is fact.
Yep. Well, Wilson is going to make a splash coming into the presidency, changing things up, and not just by canceling the inaugural ball. Other traditions, including one that began with our third president.
Yeah.
Because George Washington and John Adams had personally appeared in Congress to deliver their State of the Union addresses, but Thomas Jefferson merely sent his as written messages, and that tradition was adhered to by all of his successors until April 8th, 1913, when Wilson reinaugurated the tradition of in-person addresses to Congress by the president. He told Congress that he wanted his audience to know that the president, quote, is a person, not a mere department of the government hailing Congress from some isolated island of jealous power, sending messages, not speaking naturally and with his own voice, that he is a human being trying to cooperate with other human beings in a common service. Wilson used that speech primarily to call for tariff reform, but it signaled his intent to transform the traditional relationship between the president and Congress.
That's right. In addition to appearing in person for State of the Union addresses and other special messages to the Congress, Wilson would appear frequently in the unused President's Room at the Capitol and directly negotiate with congressmen on pending legislation. Presidents had traditionally used the Vice President, who was President of the Senate, as a liaison to Congress, but Wilson circumvented Vice President Thomas Marshall and met with congressmen himself. His longtime admiration for the British Constitution was apparent when he told a congressman that he intended to act as though he were Prime Minister, quote, as much concerned with the guidance of legislation as with the just and orderly execution of the law. Taking a different and direct approach.
This Wilson, he's a new kind of statesman. And he was calling for tariff reform. Of course, tariffs and excise taxes had always been the primary source of federal revenue. Republicans had long favored protectionist tariffs, designed not merely to raise revenue, but to protect American industries from foreign competition. Industrialists and industrial workers, mostly concentrated in the Northeast, liked protectionist tariffs, but others, particularly in the South and West, lamented the higher prices they paid. As a result, lowering tariffs was a major plank of the Democratic platform and a cornerstone of Wilson's New Freedom agenda, and he believed it was also the best means to strike at the power of monopolistic trusts. Emphasizing that issue in his first message to Congress, he engaged in extensive direct negotiations with congressmen and used patronage powers and popular pressure to forge a narrow majority.
That's just it. Signed into law in October 1913, the Underwood-Simmons Revenue Act lowered the average tariff rate from 40% to 25% and was the most significant tariff reduction since before the Civil War. Wilson even secured tariff reductions for wool and sugar, two industries where Southern and Western Democrats actually favored protectionism. With tariffs lowered, the federal government needed other sources of revenue. The 16th Amendment, ratified in the last year of the Taft administration, authorized federal income taxes. The Underwood-Simmons Act imposed a graduated income tax of 1% on incomes over $3,000, stepping up to a maximum rate of 7% for incomes over $50,000. The tax affected less than 1% of Americans and raised $71 million in revenue in its first year.
Wow. Income taxes of 1% paid by 1% of Americans.
Yeah.
Of course, it can only go up from there.
That's just it.
Speaking of our financial system, the United States had been without a central bank since President Andrew Jackson killed the second Bank of the United States in 1836. But following the Panic of 1907, in which the nation's wealthiest men under the leadership of J.P. Morgan pooled their resources to prevent a financial collapse, a consensus formed that a central banking system was needed. The National Monetary Commission, led by conservative Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich, recommended a central banking system with power to issue currency and oversee other banks. However, this plan proposed that the central banking system would be privately owned and controlled, and Democrats defeated it in 1910 because they believed it gave too much power to bankers.
That's it. Wilson favors a similar system, but with far greater government control and oversight. Working closely with Treasury Secretary McAdoo and Senator Robert Owen, Representative Carter Glass, and informal advisor Louis Brandeis, Wilson proposed the Federal Reserve Act. It would create 12 regional Federal Reserve banks that would be run by private bankers, but subject to oversight and control by the presidentially appointed Federal Reserve Board, which had power to set interest rates. Up to this time, paper currency consisted of banknotes issued by private banks, but currency issued by the regional Federal Reserve banks, Federal Reserve notes, would be, quote, obligations of the United States, rather than of the individual banks. Wilson signs the Federal Reserve Act into law in December 1913, and appoints mostly prominent bankers to its board of governors. With the outbreak of the First World War, the Federal Reserve would be instrumental in financing the Allied war effort. So some big changes going on.
Yep. More changes. In January 1914, Wilson delivered a special message to Congress calling for increased regulation of corporations. His proposals resulted in the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission, which had power to regulate unfair trade practices, issue regulations, and investigate corporations. He then signed into law the Clayton Antitrust Act, which supplemented the Sherman Antitrust Act by outlining some specific corporate practices, including price discrimination, exclusive dealing contracts, and certain anti-competitive mergers. It also prevented a person from serving on the board of directors of two or more competing corporations, a regulation designed to end the common practice whereby some business leaders, especially bankers and financiers, would sit on the boards of dozens of corporations.
Yeah. And that's going to bring us to another issue. Segregation. Racial segregation was prominent under state law, particularly in the South, of course. There was some informal segregation of federal employees under the Roosevelt and Taft administrations, including the Taft White House's employee dining room. When Wilson took office, Postmaster General Albert Burleson proposed to segregate the Post Office Department and suggested that the entire federal bureaucracy be segregated. Wilson did not issue executive orders to implement segregation, but he gave his cabinet secretaries a free hand to do as they wished. The Post Office, Treasury Department, and Navy Department introduced segregated workspaces, and other departments introduced various forms of segregation, including separate bathrooms and eating spaces. Despite protests from black leaders and communities, Wilson defended segregation by arguing that, quote, the friction, or rather the discontent and uneasiness which had prevailed in many departments would thereby be removed. It is as far as possible from being a movement against the Negroes. I sincerely believe it to be in their interest.
Well, let's see what they think about that. Booker T. Washington wrote that he had, quote, never seen the colored people so discouraged and bitter as they are at the present time. And W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that the federal segregation policy, quote, has set the colored people apart as if mere contact with them were contamination. The number of African Americans appointed to federal posts, even low and mid-level clerical jobs, declined sharply during the Wilson administration, though Wilson did appoint some African Americans to posts that were already held by African Americans. The infamously racist senators James Vardaman of Mississippi and Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina announced that they would block any appointment in which a black person, quote, is to be in command of white people, especially white women. When Wilson nominated a black man to be Register of the Treasury, post previously held by a black man, the protests from Democrats were so vociferous that the nominee asked his name to be withdrawn.
Yeah. Not too great. The Wilson administration also implemented a rule that all applicants for federal jobs had to submit a photograph with their application, which enabled the government to avoid accidentally hiring a black person. In November 1914, William Trotter, a black leader who supported Wilson in 1912, visited the White House and told Wilson that African Americans felt betrayed by his segregation policies and asked if there was a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for black Americans. Wilson lost his temper, saying, quote, your tone, sir, offends me, and adding that, quote, if the colored people made a mistake in voting for me, they ought to correct it and vote against me.
Wow.
Wow, what a fucking asshole.
Yep. Well, let's move on to something less infuriating. Mexico. Revolution broke out in Mexico in 1911, and in the final weeks of the Taft administration, Mexico's revolutionary president, Francisco Madero, was assassinated, and General Victoriano Huerta became president in a military coup. Taft deferred to the incoming administration, and upon taking office, Wilson refused to recognize the Huerta government and replaced the American ambassador who was seen as favoring Huerta's coup. Wilson stated privately, quote, "I will not recognize a government of butchers. I have to pause and remind myself that I am president of the United States and not a small group of Americans with vested interests in Mexico." Taft had resisted calls to militarily intervene in Mexico to protect American interests, and Wilson adopted a, quote, "watchful waiting policy" as to the Huerta regime. He gave a special message to Congress recommending neutrality, but then lifted an embargo to allow arms shipments to Pancho Villa, a guerrilla leader in revolt against Huerta.
That's just it. In April 1914, the Huerta regime briefly arrested some U.S. Navy sailors whose whaleboat landed at the port of Tampico, which was under martial law at the time. Huerta promptly released the sailors, but Wilson's refusal to recognize the Huerta government prevented a formal agreement to let the matter go. The incident produced outrage in Congress, which authorized Wilson to use force against Mexico, if necessary, to redress, quote, affronts and indignities. Though Wilson said he intended to prevent war, later that month, he ordered the Navy to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz to intercept an incoming shipment of German arms. 19 American sailors would be killed in the occupation of Veracruz. Wilson stated, quote, "We have gone down to Mexico to serve mankind if we can find out the way. We do not want to fight the Mexicans. We want to serve the Mexicans if we can, because we know how they would like to be free."
Well, there's some early Wilsonianism.
Yeah, it's starting to rear its head.
The intervention in Veracruz produced an outburst of anti-American sentiment in Mexico and across Latin America. In November 1914, the U.S. withdrew from Veracruz after Huerta was overthrown, and a rival, Venustiano Carranza, became Mexico's newest president. Wilson would recognize the Carranza regime in 1915, but his problems with Mexico were only going to get worse.
That's it, and we'll get back to that later. Let's hop across the globe to China. In 1913, Wilson happily recognized the new Republican government of China. The Taft administration had secured the participation of American banks in a syndicate to make major loans to the previous Chinese regime, with the bankers expecting that the U.S. government would, quote, utilize both its military and naval forces to protect the interests of the lenders should China default. With the new Chinese Republican government less enthusiastic about outside influence, Wilson repudiated any U.S. government responsibility to back the American bankers, calling such responsibility, quote, obnoxious to the principles upon which the government of our people rests.
Since we're in the Eastern Hemisphere, let's take a visit over to the Philippines, which, of course, the U.S. had annexed the Philippines in 1898, after which every Democratic Party platform pledged to grant it independence. Wilson had towed the party line, but upon taking office, he was skeptical about granting immediate independence, though he did support granting native Filipinos greater control over their government. House Democrats resolved to grant Philippine independence in 1913, but Senate Republicans blocked it. In 1916, Wilson signed into law the Jones Act, which reorganized the Filipino legislature into a fully elected House and Senate, though the territory's executive was still the presidentially appointed American Governor General. The Jones Act also pledged to grant the Philippines independence as soon as the U.S. determined that a stable government could be established there. Independence would be finally granted in 1946.
Well, it took a little time.
Took 2 world wars.
Indeed. And that's going to bring us to arbitration treaties. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan promoted his anti-imperialist, anti-war views by pursuing bilateral arbitration treaties with 40 other nations. The treaties required any dispute with the U.S. to be submitted to international arbitration and called for a 1-year cooling-off period before any hostilities could be contemplated. 30 nations would sign the treaties, not including, however, Mexico, Colombia, Japan, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. Many European countries that signed the treaties considered them irrelevant.
All the countries not signing are among the countries we're going to be at war with over the next couple of decades. Mm-hmm. Well, how about the Panama Canal? You heard a lot about that during the Teddy Roosevelt episode and the Taft episode, and now, after 10 years of construction, the Panama Canal is ready to be opened in August 1914. The U.S. treaty with Panama required the canal to be, quote, free and open to vessels of all nations on terms of entire equality. And during the final year of the Taft administration, Congress passed a law that exempted American vessels from paying tolls in the canal if they were not engaged in international trade. That is, if they were simply traveling between the United States Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Americans felt they were entitled to the exemption because they had built and paid for the canal, but Britain believed that it violated the spirit of the treaty. In March 1914, Wilson successfully lobbied Congress to repeal the exemption, telling a friend, quote, when everything else about this administration is forgotten, its attitude in the Panama Canal tolls will be remembered as putting the conduct of nations on the same basis as that which prevails among honorable individuals, where a promise is a promise and is kept regardless of personal advantage. The British ambassador called Wilson's action, quote, the finest, most dignified, most courageous thing done in the United States for many years, perhaps indeed since Lincoln's second inaugural.
Wow, some high praise from the British ambassador. But that's going to bring us the turning of the tide. Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Wilson's hope that his presidency would not be dominated by foreign affairs died on June 28, 1914, the same day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir apparent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated alongside his wife in Sarajevo by Bosnian Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip. A month of escalating tensions followed. Austria-Hungary made demands on Serbia. Russia backed Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary. France backed Russia. Britain backed France. During this critical month, Wilson said only, quote, the United States has never attempted to interfere in European affairs. As Europe spiraled out of control, Wilson was distracted. His wife was dying.
That's right. After a long spell of poor health, Ellen Wilson underwent a sudden decline, and doctors diagnosed her with Bright's disease, a fatal inflammation of the kidneys.
Our listeners may remember that is the same disease that felled Chester Arthur.
Also the same disease that felled Theodore Roosevelt's first wife, Alice.
Indeed.
When war was declared in Europe, Wilson forbade anyone to tell Ellen about it so as not to upset her, and he said, quote, I can think of nothing when my dear one is suffering. Ellen had taken an interest in the poor living conditions in Washington, D.C.'s slums, and a bill was pending in Congress to improve conditions. Urged by Wilson, Congress quickly passed the bill, which brought a smile to Ellen's face. But she died later the same day, at the age of 54. With her last words, she asked Dr. Grayson to take good care of her husband. She was the third of 3 first ladies to have died in office, after Letitia Tyler and Caroline Harrison. Ellen left an enduring mark by establishing the White House Rose Garden, and of course she was buried in it face down.
Actually, of course, she was buried in her native Georgia. Wilson was devastated by her death. His son-in-law wrote, quote, it is pathetic to see the president. He hardly knows where to turn. Wilson himself would write, quote, God has stricken me almost beyond what I can bear. He soon fell into a deep depression, saying that Ellen's death had broken his spirit and that he, quote, was not fit to be president because he did not think straight any longer and had no heart in things he was doing.
Yep, this is a turning point in the Wilson presidency. He had a couple years where he's humming along with a lot of domestic reforms, getting the agenda that he wanted, doing the things he likes, and now everything falls apart. His wife dies, war is declared in Europe, and now foreign affairs will be dominating his presidency, just like he feared.
That's just it. Wilson had issued a neutrality proclamation stating, quote, "We must be impartial in thought as well as in action, must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another." Now, neutrality of sentiment was difficult in light of America's special friendship with Britain, and especially after Germany chose to attack France by first carving a path through Belgium, violating Belgian neutrality in a brutal campaign that soon became known as the Rape of Belgium.
That's right. And the national economy of the United States had been in a recession since the beginning of 1913, and upon the outbreak of war in Europe, Treasury Secretary McAdoo concurred with the governors of the New York Stock Exchange that the exchange should be closed to prevent a panic. It remained closed for almost 5 months, the longest closure in its history. American exports suffered when European merchant vessels were pressed into military service, with the price of cotton plummeting to less than half of its pre-war price. Then J.P. Morgan and Company asked the State Department whether it would object to a $100 million loan to France, and Wilson initially denied permission for the loan, agreeing with Secretary of State Bryan that it was, quote, inconsistent with the true spirit of neutrality, and that money is the worst of all contrabands because it commands everything else. However, Wilson soon reversed his position and allowed the loan, viewing it as a credit for the purchase of American goods. American banks would issue huge loans to France and Britain, which would then purchase huge amounts of American goods, including arms. This trade quickly ended the recession, but its one-sidedness marked the de facto end of true neutrality and would cause increasing friction with Germany as it sought to interfere with its enemy's supply lines.
In December 1914, Bryan submitted a memo urging American mediation of the hostilities between the Christian nations of Europe and arguing that the United States, quote, as the leading exponent of Christianity, had a duty to be the foremost advocate of world peace. This memo prompted Wilson to doubt Bryan's suitability as Secretary of State, and on diplomatic matters, he would increasingly turn to Colonel House. Bryan was dismayed when Wilson sent House, rather than Bryan, on an unofficial diplomatic mission to Europe. Crossing the Atlantic on the British ocean liner Lusitania, House met with representatives of the major warring powers, including Germany, and found no interest in settling the war. The Bryan memo also prompted Wilson to sketch out his own ideas for an eventual peace settlement, including, quote, an association of nations wherein all shall guarantee the territorial integrity of each. This was an early blueprint of his eventual 14 points. Now, Theodore Roosevelt is going to lambaste Wilson for showing weakness in Mexico and for not standing up for the rights of Belgium. But in his December 1914 State of the Union message, Wilson tells Congress that the U.S. was not prepared for war and that he had no intentions of getting prepared, saying, quote, we never have had, and while we retain our present principles and ideals, we never shall have a large standing army.
Well, you got the 1914 midterm elections coming up at this point, and other than a few statements, Wilson did no campaigning. This is the first Senate election to be held under the 17th Amendment, which had been fully ratified in April 1913 and provided for the direct election of senators by the voters rather than by state legislatures. Democrats gained 3 Senate seats and increased their slim majority, but they lost 61 seats in the House, decreasing their huge majority to a narrow one. Wilson was dismayed by the result, believing it had showed that the voters had, quote, scantily appreciated his 2 years of hard work, and he took it personally, saying, quote, people know that to vote against a Democratic ticket is to vote indirectly against me.
Oof. He's getting salty about it. Well, earlier in the episode, we discussed the birth of Woodrow Wilson. Now, let's discuss the birth of a nation. That is D.W. Griffith's silent film, The Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman. This is the longest and most expensive film ever made at the time. It has since been called, quote, the most controversial film ever made in the United States and, quote, the most reprehensibly racist film in Hollywood history. It was a racist pro-Southern depiction of Reconstruction in which the valiant KKK pushed back against the victimization of the South by Northern carpetbaggers and blatantly stereotyped African Americans, depicted by mainly white actors in blackface as unintelligent brutes lusting after white women. The film featured title cards with quotes from Wilson's academic writings, the racist pro-Klan statements quoted earlier in the episode. The film premiered in February 1915 despite the NAACP's attempt to get an injunction against its exhibition on the grounds that it would incite racial violence. That month, it became the first motion picture shown at the White House when Wilson watched it in a private showing offered by Dixon, an old acquaintance. Upon seeing the film, Wilson allegedly said, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning, and my only regret is that it is all so terribly true."
Well, that purported quote was supposedly not attributed to Wilson until 2 decades later, and his modern biographers argue that it's unlikely he ever said it, but it sounds like something he would think. As controversy over the film swept the nation, Joseph Tumulty attempted to distance Wilson from it, saying that the president, quote, was entirely unaware of the character of the play before it was presented and has at no time expressed his approbation of it. Dixon later told Tumulty, quote, I didn't dare tell the president the real big purpose back of my film, which was to revolutionize Northern sentiments by a presentation of history that would transform every man in my audience into a good Democrat.
Well.
And he flattered the president by using his own quotes as the title cards.
That's it. Now, this is going to bring us to March 1915, just over 6 months after Ellen's death. Woodrow Wilson meets Edith Bowling Galt. Edith was born in 1872 to a formerly slave-owning Virginia plantation family. She married Norman Galt, who ran a jewelry business in Washington, D.C., and gave birth to one child who died in infancy, with complications rendering her unable to conceive more children. Her husband died in 1908, and she ran his business herself in order to pay off his debts. Then she traveled extensively through Europe and lived an independent life, becoming known as the first woman to drive her own automobile in Washington, D.C. In 1915, she was serving as an unofficial guardian for a young family friend who was being courted by Dr. Grayson. When Wilson first saw her, he asked Grayson, quote, "Who is that beautiful woman?" Grayson arranged for Edith to attend a White House luncheon, and Wilson was immediately smitten. A White House valet soon remarked, quote, "He's a goner."
Wilson invited Edith to dinner frequently, and in May, just 2 months after meeting her, he declared his love for her and asked her to marry him. She was shocked and initially said, quote, "You can't love me, for you don't really know me, and it is less than a year since your wife died." She said she needed time to consider his proposal, and he would proceed to send her multiple love letters each day. Wilson asked Colonel House whether getting remarried, quote, "would lessen my influence with the American people, and when do you think I could do it? I have led such a lonely life that I feel it is necessary for me to have companionship of that sort, and my dear dead wife would be the first to approve." Some cabinet members felt it could be politically damaging with the 1916 election a year away, but House believed that the boost to Wilson's spirits would be a political benefit outweighing any negative effects. Edith finally accepted the proposal in September 1915, and the engagement was publicly announced in October. On December 18th, 1915, the couple was married in a small private ceremony at Edith's Washington townhouse. He was 58 years old, she was 43. Edith was already Wilson's confidant on political matters, and she would eventually become perhaps the most powerful First Lady in American history.
That's right. And there's some funny stories about their courtship. There was one newspaper article that had a fantastic Freudian slip, and they were at a dinner party, and it said the misprint was, quote, "President Wilson spent much of the night entering Mrs. Galt instead of entertaining."
Yeah.
They messed it up, or did they?
Well, I think there was a joke made at the time that was like when Wilson asked Edith to marry him, she was so surprised she fell out of bed.
Yeah.
But I think I read that there was at least one incident where she rebuffed his physical advances because they were not married. But I think at least once they were engaged, he started spending time alone at her place.
Well, and for that, of course, one would have to be prepared. So let's talk preparedness. Well, no, he wouldn't have to be prepared. She couldn't have kids. He could raw dog it all he liked. As personally monumental as Wilson's new wedding was, monumentally worldwide, we got some things going on. By early 1915, the European war had descended into the brutal stalemate of trench warfare, and the British Navy had blockaded Germany, which retaliated by unleashing submarine warfare against merchant vessels supplying the Allies. Bryan sought German assurances that American vessels would be spared, but on May 1st, 1915, a German submarine torpedoed an American oil tanker, the Gulf Light, resulting in 3 American deaths. Germany apologized for the attack, but refused to alter its strategy. And by the by, this segment of the Dead Presidents podcast is sponsored by the Cunard Line and its incredible ship Lusitania, the largest and fastest steamer in service on the Atlantic Ocean, which sails to Europe via Liverpool, leaving New York on May 1st, 1915 at 10 a.m. Book your passage today.
We're also sponsored by the Imperial German Embassy, which publishes this important notice. Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk.
This just in, we have a breaking news update. The Lusitania has been sunk by a German submarine, which torpedoed it twice off the coast of Ireland. It sank in 15 minutes, and approximately 1,200 people are believed dead.
That's right. Among those dead include 128 Americans. Some Americans called for war against Germany, but during a speech in Philadelphia, Wilson argued that America must be a special example of peace and said off the cuff, quote, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight." Wilson was heavily criticized for the tone-deaf statement, with Henry Cabot Lodge later calling it, quote, the most unfortunate phrase that Wilson ever coined, and saying that it caused him to permanently lose confidence in Wilson's leadership abilities. And of course, prior to the sinking, Germany had posted advertisements in American newspapers noting that Britain and Germany were at war and that Americans traveled aboard British ships at their own risk. Yeah, those ads that we just read,
Yeah.
they were in the newspaper right next to each other. And there were lots of other stuff like in the newspapers in the days prior to the Lusitania leaving here. In the New York newspapers, the headline is like, Lusitania to be sunk on the way over.
Yeah.
Lusitania's last voyage. Like, they pretty much said we're going to sink it.
Yep.
And you got Secretary of State Bryan saying that, the Lusitania was carrying ammunition. And he argued that the U.S. should rebuke Britain, quote, for using our citizens to protect her ammunition.
That's it. He disagreed with Wilson's demand that Germany disavow its recent actions and accused fellow cabinet members of no longer being neutral. In this atmosphere, Bryan resigns as Secretary of State, telling Wilson that he, quote, cannot go on in the department as he is a pacifist and cannot follow me in wishing to warn our country and Germany that we may be forced to take up arms. Wilson is going to replace Bryan with Robert Lansing, the State Department's number 2 man, in part because Lansing lacked political stature and would allow Wilson to be, quote, practically his own Secretary of State. Germany is going to respond to Wilson's demand by saying it regretted the loss of American lives, but that Britain was essentially using Americans as human shields. In a further response, it promised to spare Americans as long as they were not transporting contraband. This is going to lead to Wilson's December 1915 State of the Union, in which he calls for increases in the regular Army and Navy supported by new taxes. The Revenue Act of 1916 is going to double income tax rates. He then embarks on a national speaking tour in favor of national defense preparedness.
Yep. War Secretary Lindley Garrison felt Wilson's measures were insufficient and resigned. Wilson replaced him with former Cleveland Mayor Newton Baker, who, like Garrison, also had no military experience, with Germany's submarine campaign increasingly resulting in the deaths of hundreds of non-American civilians. Many urged Wilson to take a harder line, but Wilson told Tumulty, quote, if my re-election as president depends upon my getting into war, I don't want to be president. In April 1916, Wilson delivered his special measures to Congress warning that the U.S. would sever diplomatic relations with Germany if it did not, quote, immediately declare in effect an abandonment of its present methods of warfare against passenger and freight-carrying vessels. Germany responded favorably, saying that it was, quote, prepared to do its utmost to confine the operations of war for the rest of its duration to the fighting forces of the belligerents, thereby also ensuring freedom of the seas.
Well,
things are getting tense.
Indeed they are, and not just in Europe. On March 9th, 1916, in retaliation for Wilson's recognition of the Carranza regime, Mexican guerrilla leader Pancho Villa crossed the border with 1,500 men and attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, looting and killing 17 Americans. With Carranza's cooperation, Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing to enter Mexico with 4,000 men to capture Pancho Villa. Pershing quickly dispersed Villa's forces, but Villa himself escaped, and as Pershing pursued him deeper into Mexico, the Carranza government turned against the American intervention. Confrontations with Carranza forces led to American deaths, and on June 21st, 1916, 12 Americans were killed and 24 captured. Wilson goes on to send 100,000 troops to the Mexican border, and Theodore Roosevelt expresses his intense desire to raise a regiment to reinforce Pershing, but both countries stated their desire to avoid war. Pershing's men are going to buckle down for 6 months, during which Mexico agrees to release its American prisoners, and Wilson agrees to withdraw from Mexico. By early 1917, all American forces had returned home. 65 Americans were killed during Pershing's expedition.
Wow. Got problems in Mexico and problems at home. In mid-1916, railroad workers' unions demanded an 8-hour workday and threatened to call a strike. When mediation by the Secretary of Labor failed, Wilson invited both sides to a White House summit, which also failed to produce an agreement, with the unions scheduling their strike to begin the following month, a strike that could bring the entire national economy to a screeching halt. Wilson, who had campaigned on reducing the standard workday from 10 to 8 hours, delivered a special message to Congress, which quickly passed the Adamson Act, establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad workers and averting the strike. It was the first federal law regulating the hours of privately employed workers, and it was passed on party lines, and both sides would highlight it in the upcoming election campaign, with Republicans calling it an anti-business sellout to union threats.
I think most people would agree that the 8-hour workday is much preferable to the 10-hour workday.
Well, maybe not if you own a railroad.
Yeah. Well, that's going to bring us on over to Supreme Court appointments. Wilson actually gets to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices during his first term. His first appointment was his Attorney General James McReynolds, who had an impressive record of antitrust prosecutions. He served on the court until 1941 and vigorously disputed the constitutionality of many of FDR's New Deal policies. He was also known for his racial bigotry and disagreeable, cantankerous personality. In fact, Wilson's third Supreme Court appointee, progressive lawyer John Clark, would resign from the court in 1922, in part over animosity with McReynolds. Wilson's most notable Supreme Court nomination was his second, made in 1916, Louis Brandeis. Brandeis was criticized as a radical activist and, quote, militant crusader for social justice. He would be the first Jewish justice, and some of the opposition to his nomination was fueled by an undercurrent of unspoken anti-Semitism. For the first time in Supreme Court confirmation history, the Senate Judiciary Committee held public hearings, and after a bitter 4-month battle, the Senate confirmed Brandeis by a vote of 47 to 22. Serving on the court until 1939, Brandeis became one of the most influential justices in history, especially for his landmark opinions in favor of the freedom of speech and the right of privacy.
It was a pretty decent accomplishment for Wilson to put under his belt.
Indeed.
And speaking of Supreme Court justices, one of those nominations he got to make, the vacancy occurred because someone resigned from the Supreme Court to run against him in the 1916 election.
That's it. It's June 1916, and it's the Republican National Convention. And they nominate former New York Governor and current Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, who, aforementioned, he's resigned now. Theodore Roosevelt is going to refuse the Progressive Party nomination, and he returns to the Republican fold to campaign for Hughes.
That's right. Democrats are going to re-nominate Wilson by acclamation, and Vice President Thomas Marshall is retained as his running mate. Though Marshall played virtually no substantive role in the administration, Wilson considered him loyal and also needed him to campaign in his home state of Indiana, a battleground that was also the home state of Hughes's running mate, former Indiana Senator and also former Vice President Charles Fairbanks. Wilson conducted mostly a front porch campaign from Shadow Lawn, his New Jersey vacation home. He emphasized how he had delivered on his 1912 campaign promises, while his surrogates promoted him with the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
That's it. Hughes calls for greater war preparedness, but Wilson's own pivot in that direction, including his tough stance against German submarine warfare, made it difficult for Hughes to outflank Wilson, short of actually calling for war, which Hughes was not prepared to do. Hughes also had difficulty in appealing to both the conservative and progressive wings of the Republican Party, while Wilson sought to lure Republican progressives into the Democratic fold. The Wilson campaign largely ignored Hughes and focused its attacks on Theodore Roosevelt, attempting to tie his warmongering rhetoric to Hughes. Asked why his campaign did not attack Hughes directly, Wilson replied, quote, "Never attempt to murder a man who is committing suicide."
Wow. But hey, Republicans are still the majority party in the nation here, and they had largely dominated presidential elections since the Civil War, so this outcome is going to be pretty close. And with the nation perilously close to war, Wilson was worried about the 4-month lame duck period that would follow if he lost the election, as discussed recently on our top 5 crazy succession scenarios.
That's right.
In an honorable mention, here's Wilson, supposedly inspired by Lincoln's private vow to cooperate with the incoming president-elect if he had lost the 1864 election. Wilson devised a drastic transition plan that he set forth in a confidential letter 2 days before the election. His plan was, if he lost the election, he would immediately ask Vice President Marshall and Secretary of State Lansing to resign. Then he would appoint Hughes as Secretary of State, placing him first in the line of succession under the Presidential Succession Act of 1886, and then Wilson himself would resign, enabling Hughes to immediately become acting president.
That's right. Wilson wrote, quote, "No such critical circumstances in regard to our foreign policy have ever before existed. It would be my duty to step aside so that there would be no doubt in any quarter how that policy was to be directed. I would have no right to risk the peace of the nation by remaining in office after I had lost my authority." On election night, it indeed appeared that Hughes had won, with some newspapers declaring him the victor the following day. However, they had counted on Hughes winning the traditional Republican stronghold of California, where votes were still being tallied. Progressives had a strong presence among California Republicans, but the Hughes campaign had favored conservatives in California and inadequately courted its progressives. Some also blamed Roosevelt's warmongering for turning California progressives toward Wilson. In any event, Wilson pulled off a surprise victory in California, capturing its 13 electoral votes and tipping the Electoral College in his favor 277 to 254. Wilson also won 49% of the popular vote versus 46% for Hughes. He was the first Democratic incumbent president to win re-election since Andrew Jackson in 1832. That's going back.
Wow.
Democrats, as a bonus, are also going to maintain narrow majorities in the House and the Senate.
And that brings us to the First World War.
That's it.
The slogan, quote, "He kept us out of war," was carefully phrased in the past tense, with no guarantees for the future. After the election, several Americans died in German submarine attacks against British shipping, and as the potential for war increased, Wilson was determined to exhaust all avenues for peace. On December 18th, 1916, he sent a peace note to the warring powers, asking each to state, quote, "a concrete definition of the guarantees which they deem it their duty to demand as a practical satisfaction of the objects they are aiming at in this contest of force." On January 22nd, 1917, Wilson gave a speech in the Senate calling for the U.S. to form, quote, "a league of peace," arguing that a lasting peace required, quote, "peace without victory. Victory would mean peace forced upon the loser, a victor's terms imposed upon the vanquished. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory, upon which terms of peace would rest not permanently, but only as upon quicksand."
A week later, Germany announced a new policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and Wilson told Tumulty, quote, "This means war. The break that we have tried so hard to prevent now seems inevitable. the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Germany. On February 25th, the British revealed to Wilson an intercepted telegram from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, asking Mexico to ally with Germany in a war against the United States and proposing that upon victory, Mexico could reclaim its former territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. German submarines torpedoed American merchant ships and killed dozens of Americans. In late March, Wilson agreed with the cabinet that there was no other option but war.
Presidential war.
Presidential war. No, stop. Stop
Wait.
it. Stop.
This is not presidential war. This is real war.
This is real war.
Yep. On April 2nd, Wilson appeared before a joint session of Congress and asked it to declare that a state of war existed between the United States and Germany. He stated that the United States would fight, quote, for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations great and small and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life and of obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them.
Well, there's some high and mighty words.
Yep.
And the declaration of war is going to pass by a vote of 82-6 in the Senate and 373-50 in the House. The idea that the United States acted abroad to benevolently spread principles of freedom and democracy became known as Wilsonianism. It became an enduring theme of American foreign policy and would be frequently used to justify American intervention in foreign countries.
A very influential idea.
That's it. However, the U.S. is not prepared for war. With only 300,000 men, its army ranks between Belgium and Portugal. Wilson wants to increase the army to 1 million and hopes for an all-volunteer force, but when less than 100,000 men volunteer in the first 6 weeks, a draft is instituted.
Yep, the Selective Service Act of 1917 required all men between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for the draft, and unlike the Civil War draft, it allowed no substitutes. It was going to take time to raise, train, and equip the Army, and the U.S. Army would not make a major appearance on the European front until 1918. Meanwhile, Theodore Roosevelt begs Wilson to allow him to raise a volunteer division to join the fight immediately, but Wilson turned him down. Also, General Leonard Wood, TR's close friend, expected to be named the overall commander of U.S. forces, but he had criticized Wilson's pre-war unpreparedness and, like TR, was a potential Republican contender for the presidency in 1920. Wilson relegated Wood to training conscripts at home, and he named General John J. Pershing to the top command.
That's it. Blackjack Pershing. While its army takes the time to build, the U.S. can help the Allies most immediately by providing money, supplies, and food. Wilson asked America to, quote, correct her unpardonable fault of wastefulness, and called for a national belt-tightening policy. To head the new U.S. Food Administration, Wilson names Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer and financier who had organized food relief for Belgium. Americans were encouraged to save food by having meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays, and sweetless Saturdays, as well as fuck it Fridays. No, they wouldn't have fuck it Fridays. Yeah. That'd be wasteful.
Well, with alliteration like that, how could you say no?
That's it. The U.S. substantially increased its food production and, in the first year of the war, doubles its food exports to Europe. Americans saved energy with heatless, lightless, and gasless days. Wilson ordered that the nation's railroads be placed under federal control to maximize efficiency. Treasury Secretary McAdoo, the former railroad executive, administered the railroads effectively while also taking charge of financing the war. Businesses paid new excess profits taxes, and the personal income tax rate was raised from 2% to 12%. The richest 22% of Americans paid 96% of income taxes.
Wow. Didn't take too long from taxes to go from 1% paid by 1% of Americans. Within a few years, we're already up to 12%, and 22% of Americans are paying it.
That's it. The government is going to raise most of its money by issuing Liberty bonds and casting it as the patriotic duty of all Americans to purchase them. Most did, and over $20 billion was raised. An incredible sum.
Yep. Speaking of patriotic duty, a fervor of America First patriotism sweeps the nation. Wilson establishes the Committee on Public Information to create enthusiasm and public support for the war effort. Its chairman described its mission as generating, quote, not propaganda as the Germans defined it, but propaganda in the true sense of the word, meaning the propagation of faith.
Oh, well, there you go. Propaganda is a good thing.
Good propaganda. The Committee on Public Information enlisted 75,000 speakers known as 4-Minute Men to give short speeches on patriotic topics and promote the purchase of Liberty bonds, often at movie theaters, during the 4 minutes it took for projectionists to change reels.
Not to be confused with the 4-Minute Men that James J. Hamilton was a part of.
Historians and publicists wrote pro-American pamphlets. Painters created pro-American images, including the famous iconic recruiting poster with Uncle Sam saying, "I want you," for U.S. Army. And movies were produced with anti-German messages, including one in which a German officer tries to rape a Red Cross nurse and then throws a baby out of a window.
You're talking Erich von Stroheim right there. Erich von Stroheim, one of the great early directors in Hollywood. Yeah, he is going to play these Hun roles. The despicable Hun is going to become a part of American cinema. And Uncle Sam, the image of Uncle Sam, he was a real man. That was based off of a real man. You know what he was? He was a meat inspector.
Oh, yeah?
That's true. That was a question on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I think the Norm edition.
Really?
I think so.
Cool. Well, in June 1917, Wilson signed into law the Espionage Act, which made it a crime punishable by death or 30 years imprisonment to convey information with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of the U.S. Armed Forces or to promote its enemy's success. It also authorized the Postmaster General to refuse to mail any publications he determined violated the act. Joseph Tumblety warned Wilson that the Alien and Sedition Acts of the John Adams administration were remembered as an indefensible blunder, but Wilson paid the advice no heed.
That's it. In May 1918, the Espionage Act is expanded by the Sedition Act, which makes it a crime to use, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the U.S. government or armed forces, or language that caused others to view the U.S. government or its institutions with contempt, and also authorize the Postmaster General to deny mail to any offending publications. Imagine if Twitter and Facebook were around then.
Yeah, well, that's...
The jails would be stocked.
Yep. Well, and rather than Twitter and Facebook, Postmaster General uses the mail to deplatform publications.
That's right.
Because if they're denied mailing privileges, they're effectively shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And Postmaster General Albert Burleson enthusiastically suppressed even mildly anti-war newspapers and magazines, particularly socialist publications, and fear of suppression caused many publications to censor themselves, and many foreign language publications had to shut down simply due to the burdensome requirement that they submit English language translations to the post office and obtain pre-approval before publishing.
Yeah, so they make it a pain in the ass.
Some victims of censorship complained to Wilson, and he expressed some sympathy but did nothing to curtail Burleson's aggressive censorship campaign. In fact, in a September 1917 letter to the Attorney General, Wilson enclosed an obscure anti-war newspaper saying, quote, "I would very much like you to seriously consider whether publications like the enclosed do not form a sufficient basis for a trial for treason.
Wow.
One conviction would probably scotch a great many snakes."
There you go. Wilson willing to put somebody completely down, like whatever that could mean. I mean, treason, I would assume they're going to put this person to death.
Yeah.
And then that would scare everybody else off. Now, thousands of Americans were convicted under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, especially for advocating defiance of the draft or even expressing mild disapproval of the draft or the war. It was easy for the government to obtain convictions on questionable charges because juries felt pressured to prove their own loyalty by voting guilty. Now, that's a fucked up scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Many prominent socialist leaders were imprisoned, most prominently Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party's four-time presidential candidate who actually won 6% of the national popular vote in 1912. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for saying, quote, "They have always taught you that it is your patriotic duty to go to war and to have yourselves slaughtered at their command. But in all the history of the world, you, the people, never had a voice in declaring war." Mic drop.
Yeah, well, that's all it took. Well, it seemed, they were out to get him anyway.
Sure.
And once he said that, 10 years in prison.
That's it. Wilson is going to argue that while Debs had the right to exercise freedom of speech before the war, quote, "Once the Congress of the United States declared war, silence on his part would have been the proper course to pursue." Wilson later called Debs, quote, "a traitor to his country," and even after the war was over, rejected advice to pardon him. Many socialists voted for Wilson in 1916 because he kept us out of war. And because Debs was not on the ballot. And if asked, Wilson surely would have said, if, quote, "the socialists made a mistake in voting for me, they ought to correct it and vote against me."
In 1920, Debs ran for president from prison and received 900,000 votes.
There you have it.
Many conscientious objectors who refused military service were held in military prisons, and some were subjected to brutal mistreatment. The Army established a new intelligence division to combat subversion at home by spying on American citizens, and its commander, the former head of Army intelligence efforts to combat rebels in the Philippines, promoted the establishment of the Justice Department-sponsored, semi-official American Protective League, in which 250,000 citizen volunteers policed the home front for radicals, essentially acting as vigilantes with carte blanche to violate the civil liberties of pacifists, socialists, and immigrants.
Yeah, some pretty messed up shit.
Pro-business forces had been in conflict with labor unions for decades, and the new patriotic fervor provided an open season to attack the generally pacifist, socialist-leaning unions.
The industrial workers of the world was baselessly accused of promoting industrial sabotage and was persecuted almost out of existence, including a mass trial in which 101 IWW members were convicted on a flimsy conspiracy to obstruct the war effort. Immigrants were accused of divided loyalties, and Wilson was suspicious of, quote, hyphenated Americans. Example, German American. He declared, quote, "Any man who carries a hyphen about him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic whenever he gets ready." Sounds a little extreme, but I I guess with the Bolshevik Revolution underway in Russia, immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe, and particularly Jews, they're suspected of communist sympathies. So, the Immigration Act of 1918 authorizes the deportation of immigrants with questionable loyalties, especially anarchists and communists. Now, there is an intense campaign against all things German going on. German language books are being burned. German operas canceled. Anything with a German name had its name changed. Talk about Liberty Cabbage.
Mm-hmm. No more sauerkraut.
Right.
You also got the German Savings Bank of Brooklyn becoming Lincoln Savings Bank.
Yeah. And not to mention, a lot of German Americans are feeling compelled to change their names.
Mm-hmm.
People like Mueller are changing their name to Miller.
Yep.
It's pretty fucking messed up. And, you know, this isn't the end of that. We're going to see it later.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, this is just pretty intense.
It is. It's kind of beyond the pale, to be honest. I can't imagine if something like this were going on today, like the reaction online you'd see.
I mean, yeah, there is like a whole book about this called American Midnight, The Great War of Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis by Adam Hochschild.
Great title.
I read. It's a very good book, and I mean, what we just went through is only like the tip of the iceberg, really, as to how. How this shit was.
This shit was deep. Wartime race relations. Not a great thing. Let's just get into it. War production is going to cause a huge increase in factory jobs in the North, and it's going to prompt a major migration of African Americans moving from South to North for work. In some places, the white population resents the new arrivals, especially where African Americans are willing to work for low wages and undercut white demands for better pay. They took their gear. That was the situation in East St. Louis, Illinois, across the river from St. Louis, Missouri, where on July 1st, 1917, some angry, drunken whites invaded a black neighborhood and opened fire. When black men fired back and 2 whites were killed, a white mob burned the black neighborhood to the ground, massacred approximately 100 African Americans, and forced 7,000 to flee into Missouri. Now, you remember being taught that in school? I don't remember that. But the National Guard was called in to restore order. However, many white National Guardsmen joined in the destruction.
Yep, the co-founder of the NAACP asked Wilson to take action, but he concluded that it was a local matter that presented no grounds for federal involvement.
Disgusting.
A major civil rights demonstration was held in New York, while race riots would occur in several more cities. One member of an NAACP delegation that asked Wilson to condemn mob violence left the White House with, quote, the conviction that at bottom there was something hypocritical about him. Wilson did issue a statement condemning lynching, but the hopes of African Americans that their participation in the national war effort would earn them respect and recognition went unmet. The Army had been traditionally segregated and remained so during the First World War. Southern whites protested against black units being stationed in their states, and racist Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman warned that if black soldiers were, quote, inflated with military airs, it is but a short step to the conclusion that their political rights must be respected.
Oh, well, heaven forbid.
Over 400,000 African Americans served in uniform, but most were relegated to non-combat duties like digging trenches. However, those that engaged in combat fought valiantly and suffered a death rate twice that of white American soldiers. A white American officer was overheard saying, quote, send the N-words to the front and there won't be so many around in New York.
What an asshole.
a French Army memo revealed that white American officers asked the French Army not to fraternize with black soldiers because they, quote, are afraid that contact with the French will inspire in black Americans aspirations which to them appear intolerable. Wilson later said that the respect some black Americans received from the French, quote, has gone to their heads.
Absolutely despicable. Really, really disgusting stuff. And that brings us to the 19th Amendment.
You know,
Don't laugh at that.
just when you thought things couldn't get any darker and more dystopian, Wilson's going to come out in favor of women's suffrage.
That's right. During Wilson's presidency, the women's suffrage movement reached new heights, with more and more states, particularly Western states, granting women the right to vote. Wilson initially expressed lukewarm support for women's suffrage, but when asked to support a constitutional amendment, he said he had a conviction, quote, that changes of this sort ought to be brought about state by state. In 1917, suffragettes protested outside the White House with signs calling the president Kaiser Wilson and accusing him of hypocrisy by supporting democracy for the world, but not for American women. In November 1917, suffragettes won a major victory when New York granted women's suffrage by referendum. When the Women's Suffrage Amendment came to a vote in the House in January 1918, Wilson urged Democrats to support it. It passed the House, but it's going to face more opposition in the Senate, prompting Wilson to appear in the Senate and speak in its favor. He argues that it is vital to the war effort, saying, quote, we have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? Southern Democratic senators blocked the amendment, but Wilson continued to lobby them until it passed in June 1919. The 19th Amendment became part of the Constitution in August 1920 after being ratified by 3/4 of the states.
Well, there you go.
Well, yeah, he's taken the right stance there. I mean, rare, but,
Well,
you know.
Wilson,
Maybe he's influenced by his wife a little bit.
yeah, well, Wilson, he takes some good idealistic stands amidst some of the other BS that has been going on.
Well, that's for sure.
That's going to bring us to the 14 points. In September 1917, Wilson appointed Colonel House to lead a secret study group composed mostly of academics. Academia running wild here.
Yep.
They're going to make recommendations for eventual peace negotiations. Wilson incorporated their report into a speech he delivered to Congress on January 8th, 1918, in which he laid down the 14 points. They included
1,
open diplomacy without secret treaties,
2,
freedom of navigation on the seas,
3,
free trade among nations,
4,
mutual arms reduction by all nations,
5,
adjustment of all colonial claims in light of popular sovereignty, and points 6 through 13 were recognition or territorial reorganization based on self-determination in
Russia, Belgium, France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, the Balkans, Turkey,
and
Poland.
And finally,
14.
quote, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike.
That's it. Wilson says, quote, what is at stake now is the peace of the world. What we are striving for is a new international order based upon broad and universal principles of right and justice, no mere peace of shreds and patches. People are not to be handed about from one sovereignty to another by an international conference of an understanding between rivals and antagonists. National aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. It is an imperative principle of action, which statesmen will henceforth ignore at their peril.
Wow. Delivered just months before American forces joined the European front in large numbers, Wilson's speech was seen as an inspirational call to arms, and it marked out Wilson as the moral and idealistic leader of the Allied cause. Even some vocal opponents of the war, such as Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette, admired the principles Wilson laid out and began to entertain hopes that the war really might end up remaking the world for the better.
Well, we'll see if their hopes aren't dashed upon the rocks of reality. 4 million soldiers were drafted in the U.S. Army, and over 2 million were in France by the summer of 1918, with 10,000 more arriving every day. While the new Bolshevik Russian regime made a separate peace with Germany in early 1918, the powers on both sides of the Western Front were exhausted, and had stretched their manpower to the limit. The arrival of huge numbers of fresh American troops would eventually demoralize the Germans and help turn the tide decisively in the Allies' favor. In March 1918, Germany launched the Ludendorff Offensive in a desperate attempt to win the war before the Americans could make an impact, and while they gained significant territory, they failed to make a breakthrough and suffered losses they could not replace. Over the summer, the Allies launched counteroffensives in which the Americans made their presence felt, especially in the victorious battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood. The inexperienced Americans suffered high casualties, but fought with enthusiasm and were eager for a chance to make their mark.
That's right. At Belleau Wood, when retreating French troops advised American soldiers to do likewise, the American officer replied, quote, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." By October, German morale collapsed, and its chancellor asked Wilson to invite the belligerents to discuss peace and accepted the 14 points as a basis of negotiations. The Kaiser abdicated, and an armistice was agreed on November 11th, 1918. During the war, Americans suffered 116 dead and 204,000 wounded.
You said 116 dead.
That's right.
That's incredible.
During the war, Americans suffered 116,000 dead and 204,000 wounded. Among all nations, the war resulted in between 15 and 20 million dead and 23 million wounded.
Some terrible prices to pay. And just as the war is wrapping up, Americans are headed to the polls in the 1918 midterm elections. Republicans are critical of Wilson's leadership, with some campaigning against his 14 points peace plan. Henry Cabot Lodge argues that the League of Nations is a utopian scheme, while Roosevelt demands Germany's unconditional surrender and calls the 14 points a conditional surrender by the United States. Against the advice of Edith and Colonel House, Wilson issues this statement to voters. Quote, "If you have approved of my leadership and wish me to continue to be your unembarrassed spokesman in affairs at home and abroad, I earnestly beg that you will express yourself unmistakably to that effect by returning a Democratic majority to both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The return of a Republican majority to either house of the Congress would, moreover, certainly be interpreted on the other side of the water as a repudiation of my leadership." Wilson is going to be lambasted for this statement, and when Republicans do go on to win the election and capture both houses of Congress, they interpret the result as a repudiation of Wilson. TR is going to go on to say, quote, "He demanded a vote of confidence. The people voted a want of confidence."
Well, with that vote of no confidence,
Yeah.
Wilson will now step out onto the world stage.
Indeed, he's heading off to France.
In a way that no American president ever had before. A peace conference is scheduled in Paris, and Wilson makes the controversial decision to attend in person. He would be the first sitting president to travel to Europe, and apart from a 2-week trip back to the United States, he would be out of the country for over 6 months.
That's pretty wild.
He appointed commissioners to accompany him, including Colonel House and Secretary of State Lansing, and he rejected suggestions that a Republican senator be included, given the Senate's role in ratifying treaties. Arriving in Europe in December 1918, Wilson was cheered as a savior by huge, enthusiastic crowds. In Rome, he addressed the Italian parliament and was hailed as, quote, the god of peace. In Paris, Wilson was one of the Big Four leaders at the conference, along with French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. Germany and its allies were not invited and did not participate in the negotiations, nor did Russia, which was still in the midst of a civil war.
That's it. While Wilson believes that only, quote, a peace of justice can rebuild and stabilize Europe, his fears that his allies would insist on, quote, a peace of force and vengeance were soon realized. Wilson prioritized the establishment of the League of Nations, while Britain wanted to seize Germany's navy. France wanted Germany to pay huge reparations and give up massive swaths of territory. Italy demanded territory on the Balkans' Adriatic coast, and Japan insisted on keeping a Chinese province it had seized from Germany. Wilson believed that the conference would be a, quote, laughingstock if it was seen as the victors carving up and parceling out the territory of the losers, but he agreed to a system of mandates that some argued were colonies in all but name, with Britain and France gaining protectorates over various Middle Eastern and African colonies formerly under the sway of the German or Ottoman empires. Wilson succeeded in forming new nations in Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and an independent Poland. He also chaired the conference's Committee on the League of Nations. He went back to the U.S. at the end of February, ostensibly to sign bills passed at the end of the congressional session, but Republicans mounted a filibuster and produced no bills. Instead, they signed a letter pledging opposition to the League of Nations and warning Wilson to keep the League separate from the peace treaty.
Well, returning to Paris, Wilson felt that in his absence, Colonel House had compromised Wilson's positions and caved in to too many British and French demands, such as reparations. Wilson turned his back on Colonel House, privately referring to him as, quote, a jellyfish and a dilettante.
Wow.
And would never see him again after the conference ended. Wilson felt he had to start all over, but in the face of his implacable and more diplomatically crafty allies, he himself eventually caved on all the same points House did, and more. British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that Wilson was outfoxed by the Allied leaders, quote, like a blind and deaf Don Quixote entering a cavern where the swift and glittering blade was in the hands of the adversary. In April, Wilson suffered a health breakdown that was likely another small stroke, and he exhibited strange behaviors like obsessively rearranging the furniture in his rooms and believing the hotel employees were all French spies. By the end of the conference, Wilson got the League of Nations, but little else he wanted. Germany learned about the treaty's final terms for the first time when it was presented to them as a fait accompli. It included $5 billion in reparations, the loss of 25,000 square miles of German territory, the surrender of most of its navy, a restriction that its army not exceed 100,000 men, and a war guilt clause that required Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war. The Germans considered repudiating the treaty but consented because their country was starving under a British naval blockade. Upon leaving Europe, Wilson said to Edith, quote, Well, little girl, it is finished, and as no one is satisfied, it makes me hope we have made a just peace, but it is all in the lap of the gods.
Now, as we know, a two-thirds vote of the Senate is needed to ratify any treaty, and Wilson is going to face an uphill battle in the narrowly Republican Senate. He delivered the treaty to the Senate in person and spoke in its favor, and met personally with many senators, but he did not have enough votes to ratify. Most Democrats supported the treaty, but a group of Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge, known as the Irreconcilables, wanted to defeat the treaty at all costs and embarrass Wilson. More moderate Republicans, known as reservationists, supported ratifying the treaty with certain reservations to clarify American sovereignty. Reservationists included Elihu Root and William Howard Taft. The controversy centered on the League of Nations, which established the mandate system and an international court of justice, and required its members to submit disputes to arbitration. But its most controversial position was Article X. Sorry, that's Article 10.
Yeah.
Which stated, quote, "The members of the League undertake to respect and preserve, as against external aggression, the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League." Now, opponents are going to argue that this provision abrogated U.S. sovereignty and required the U.S. to go to war at the behest of the League. Wilson argues that it did not bind the U.S. to go to war without congressional approval, but when Republicans proposed adding reservations to make that explicit, he said they were, quote-unquote, nullifying the treaty. Wilson hopes to apply popular pressure on recalcitrant senators, and in September 1919, he embarks on a major speaking tour to promote the treaty in western states.
Yep, in one speech he said, quote, "I have come out to fight for a cause. That cause is greater than the Senate. It is greater than the government. It is as great as the cause of mankind. And I intend, in office or out, to fight that battle as long as I live."
More high and mighty words from Woodrow Wilson.
He declared that, quote, "The isolation of the United States is at an end, not because we chose to go into the politics of the world, but because we have become a determining factor in the history of mankind." After 2 weeks of this tour, Dr. Grayson observed Wilson's shaky health and urged him to cut the tour short, but he refused. Wilson soon suffered a breakdown that may have involved yet another stroke. His face twitched, his left arm and leg were numb, and saliva drooled from his mouth. He tearfully faced the facts, saying, quote, "I seem to have gone to pieces. The doctor is right. I am in no condition to go on." Wilson returned to Washington, and the press was told that the tour was canceled because he had suffered, quote, "a nervous reaction in the digestive organs."
"We had to cancel the tour because the president shit himself."
Well, when that's a better, more attractive statement to make than the truth is pretty dark.
That's just it. A few days after returning to the White House on October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffered a major stroke that rendered him paralyzed on his left side, with the left side of his face drooping and unable to see out of his right eye. White House usher Ike Hoover recalled, quote, "He looked as if he were dead." Hoover also recalled being ordered to divulge, quote, "no details, no explanations to anyone." A conspiracy to cover up Wilson's condition was already underway, centering around Edith, Dr. Grayson, and Joseph Tumulty. When Edith initially called for Dr. Grayson during Wilson's stroke, she went out of her way to use a private phone not connected to the White House switchboard. Edith later recalled that Dr. Francis Dercum had told her that, quote, "for Mr. Wilson to resign would have a bad effect on the country and a serious effect on our patient." To spare Wilson the burdens of office while he recovered, Dr. Dercum told Edith, quote, "have everything come to you. Weight the importance of each matter, and see if it is possible by consultation with the respective heads of the departments to solve them without the guidance of your husband." Edith Wilson did just that.
That's right. Newspapers printed rumors that Wilson had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, but Dr. Grayson issued vague denials and got Wilson's other physicians to agree on a code of silence. Tumulty deflected questions from Secretary of State Lansing and refused to let him or other cabinet members see the president. Before his stroke, Wilson had planned to fire Lansing, interpreting his lack of enthusiasm for the League of Nations as disloyalty and ingratitude. Dr. Grayson refused to certify Wilson as disabled, frustrating Lansing's suggestion that Vice President Marshall serve as acting president. With Dr. Grayson telling them Wilson's mind remained clear and unaffected, the cabinet felt it could do nothing, and recalled that President Garfield had laid incapacitated for 2 months after being shot without any declaration of disability, and with the cabinet keeping the government going without presidential involvement. Marshall was kept largely in the dark and was not allowed to see Wilson, and he refused to consider assuming presidential powers without a joint resolution from Congress. While some congressmen considered such a resolution, many others, including opponents of the League of Nations, were more than happy to have an incapacitated Wilson at the helm.
That's it. In late October, when Congress passed the Volstead Act to implement the recently ratified 18th Amendment establishing alcohol prohibition, a presidential veto issued from the White House was promptly overridden by Congress. Wilson had not supported prohibition and stayed away from the issue, but he likely had no knowledge of the veto, with the decision being made by Edith and Tumulty, who wrote the veto message. No government officials laid eyes on Wilson for over a month. No one shaved him, and he grew a long white beard, and he was pushed around in a wheelchair. In November, his protectors allowed brief visits to a few friendly cabinet members and congressmen who reported that Wilson's mind was sound. His mind was sound, but he was physically debilitated and lacked the energy to do much of anything. Under doctor's orders to rest, he discussed some political issues, but most government business was kept from him by Edith and Tumulty. In December, the tradition of presidents delivering the State of the Union address as a written message only was revived, with the address being written by Tumulty, with minor revisions by Wilson, and opponents openly questioning its authorship. Also in December, 2 hostile Republican senators were allowed to meet briefly with Wilson, who remained in bed, but managed to convince his interlocutors that he was sound of mind. There's that great drunk history where they do that scene.
There's one with Wilson?
Yeah, where he's had the stroke, and they try to, the story is they tried to put his bed in a position where the left side of his face was in the shadows. So that his right side would be visible, and they had him looking like he was reading a paper, and he could just kind of glance up and try and talk out of the right side of his mouth.
Wow. So this is a pretty effed up situation.
Yeah.
So this is the president we have now, because nobody's going to suggest that the vice president, or rather no one's going to let the vice president take over.
Yeah.
So the country will amble on. And there's one issue that still excites Wilson, and that is the treaty. He remains stubbornly opposed to any treaty reservations, saying, quote, "I have no moral right to accept any change in a paper I have signed." And he argued that, quote, "the nation's honor is at stake, and that reservations would, quote, humiliate the United States before all of the Allied countries." Many of Wilson's friends urged him to accept mild reservations, advising that the treaty would pass easily, but he remained adamant. On November 19th, the Lodge reservations were defeated in the Senate, and the unmodified treaty was also defeated. Wilson would maintain hope that the treaty would be revived and resubmitted, and even fantasized about putting the treaty up for public referendum in a bizarre scenario by which the treaty opponents would agree to resign from the Senate and face re-election, and if voters returned them to office, Wilson himself would resign.
Wow.
Well, this is like the crazy stuff that he has going on.
Yeah.
And if Vice President Marshall had been empowered to exercise presidential powers, the treaty would certainly have passed with mild reservations. In the end, the United States never ratified the treaty and never joined the League of Nations. And its involvement in the First World War did not technically end until July 1921, when Congress passed a joint resolution signed by Wilson's successor. Nevertheless, in 1920, Wilson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role as a founder of the League of Nations. The League proved to be an utter failure in preventing another war, and was especially ineffective in enforcing its guarantees of collective security. Germany, Japan, and Italy simply left the League when they wanted to seize new territories, and the Soviet Union joined late and was expelled in 1939 after invading Finland.
Yeah, it just didn't work out. It was a nice idea in concept, but just couldn't realistically pan out.
Yeah, and I mean, you can almost kind of see that coming with the way Wilson talked idealistically about peace. Had a lot of good ideas, but none of them are realistic.
Right.
And the way that, he talked about before the end of the war, talked about how a punitive peace would just cause resentment in another war. I mean, that's popularly acknowledged to be a major cause of World War II.
Yeah.
I mean, Wilson's one quote that we read earlier about that could have easily been in Mein Kampf by, Hitler using it as justification for Germany fighting back.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing for Wilson is that those were the ideals he went into the peace conference with. None of them were enacted. But then when he comes back with this treaty, he kind of almost acts as if it were the idealistic treaty that he wanted.
Yeah.
And he acts about the League of Nations as if it is going to result in something idealistic instead of what a gathering of the nations just resulted in.
Yeah, Obi-Wan would have said he's off on some damn fool idealistic crusade.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, they made this peace without Germany even being consulted.
Well, that's another thing.
Speaking of other things.
Yeah, that's going to bring us to, we last mentioned there the Soviet Union being expelled from the League of Nations. Well, the Soviet Union is creeping on over into the United States with the Red Scare.
Mm-hmm.
Many important post-war developments occurred without Wilson's participation or even his knowledge. The end of wartime industrial production contributes to a major economic recession with massive unemployment, extreme currency deflation, dramatic stock market declines, and widespread labor strikes. This labor unrest helps fuel the Red Scare, a severe crackdown on anything and anyone perceived as having communist or anarchist sympathies. Russia's Bolshevik Revolution instilled fear that communist revolutions might spread throughout the world. When the Bolshevik regime made peace with Germany in 1918, the Allied powers occupied some parts of Russia and began aiding anti-communist forces in the Russian Civil War. Wilson ordered 5,000 American troops to take control of a railroad depot in the Russian city Archangel and did not withdraw them until June 1919, sowing a major distrust between the U.S. and the Soviet government. In the U.S., the wave of labor strikes, coupled with a series of unsolved anarchist mail bombings, leads some alarmists to believe that a communist revolution is imminent.
Yep, in October 1919, with Wilson incapacitated, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer took it upon himself to launch a series of raids against suspected radicals. And he's aided by the young J. Edgar Hoover, the 24-year-old head of the Bureau of Investigation's Radical Division, who used warrantless wiretaps and undercover informants to identify targets, and federal agents rounded up and arrested 10,000 suspected radicals.
Wow.
Though the raids yielded virtually no evidence of illegal activity, Palmer and Hoover sought massive deportations under the Immigration Act of 1918. However, deportations had to be signed off on by the Labor Department, and acting Labor Secretary Louis Post refused to authorize most of the deportations. Palmer and Hoover sought to have Post impeached, but the effort lost steam when Post helped organize a backlash against Palmer's violation of civil liberties, and also when the radical uprisings Palmer predicted failed to materialize. In April 1920, Wilson attended his first cabinet meeting since his stroke, and with the cabinet members arguing vociferously over Post's action, Wilson seemed to have no knowledge that the Palmer raids had even occurred.
Wow.
Now, this is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
You have, one cabinet secretary trying to get another cabinet secretary impeached.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, if two cabinet secretaries are arguing about what policy should be pursued, the president would decide.
Yeah, but now in this case, the president is incapacitated.
He's totally out to lunch, and you have two cabinet departments going
head to head,
war against each other, and he has no idea what's going on at all.
Yeah, that is not a good situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're now, we're up to late 1920. The war's been over for 2 years. Many who were imprisoned for disloyalty and sedition are being quietly released, but Wilson is still going to refuse to pardon Eugene V. Debs, even after Debs received over 900,000 votes in the 1920 presidential election, and even when Palmer recommended the pardon.
That's it. Wilson is not going to budge, saying, quote, "They will say I am cold-blooded and indifferent, but it will make no impression on me. This man was a traitor to his country, and he will never be pardoned during my administration." Learning that Wilson had again denied his pardon, Debs said, quote, "It is he, not I, who needs a pardon." Debs would be pardoned by Wilson's successor. And speaking of which, that's going to bring us to the 1920 election.
Yep, in early 1920, Wilson told Dr. Grayson that he was considering running for a third term.
Oof.
With Grayson afraid to tell him that, quote, it was impossible for him to take part in such a campaign. Refusing to support or acknowledge any other Democratic candidates, Wilson fantasized about gaining a third term for the sole purpose of fighting for the League of Nations Treaty and planned to resign upon its ratification. Dr. Grayson made efforts to prevent the Democratic Convention from turning to Wilson by quietly warning some party operatives that, quote, "No matter what you may read about the president being on the road to recovery, I tell you that he is permanently ill physically, is gradually weakening mentally, and can't recover."
Ouch. With the convention deadlocked, Wilson consents to a plan by Bainbridge Colby, who had recently replaced Lansing as Secretary of State, to put Wilson's name forward as a compromise candidate. But party insiders forced Colby to rescind the plan. Eventually, Ohio Governor James M. Cox beat out Treasury Secretary McAdoo and Attorney General Palmer for the Democratic nomination. Wilson was, quote, "a bitter man" over Cox's nomination, not because he disliked Cox, but because he didn't get it himself. Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding won the Republican nomination and beat Cox in a landslide. Wilson ended his presidency in extreme bitterness. He blackballed appointments and bills sponsored by congressmen on his quote-unquote enemies list. He refused to donate money to Princeton because he lacked faith in its, quote, present administration, and he even asked the Secret Service to apprehend motorists who sped past his car and asked the Attorney General whether he had power to fine them $1,000.
Wow.
On March 4th, 1921, Wilson rode with Harding to his inauguration, but did not stay for the swearing-in because he could not get up the stairs.
I guess ramps wouldn't be installed until the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration.
I reckon not. And that's going to bring us to the sad end of Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and it doesn't look like he has much hope ahead of him. We're going to find out exactly what Woodrow Wilson's going to get himself into post-presidency after this word from our sponsors. The Dead Presidents Podcast is brought to you in part by Dr. O.A. Young. Dr. O.A. Young offers free exams and free consultations, and he personally sees and treats every one of his patients. Rather than us telling you how great Dr. Young is, we'll read a letter written by one of his grateful patients, Oscar Hart. Mr. Hart writes, quote, "Dear Doctor, I was brought to your office to consult with you after suffering a stroke of paralysis which completely paralyzed my left side. I had treated with a number of prominent physicians and received no benefit whatsoever, and when I called on you, I was unable to even stand on my own without support. But now, under your treatment in less than 6 weeks, I'm walking 2 miles a day without assistance, and could walk a great deal more if I wished to. You are the only physician that I ever knew who could cure a stroke of paralysis, and I feel I would not be alive today if I had not found you and taken your treatment. I hope this letter will be read by others who have had strokes of paralysis, as I know that you can do for others what you have done for me." Listeners, if you're among the inner circle of intimates around a prominent man who has suffered a debilitating stroke of paralysis, and you need to keep his condition hidden from public view, call Dr. Young today. This unfortunate man's inability to discharge the powers and duties of his office is nobody's business, and with Dr. Young on your team, he'll be back on his feet before anyone finds out. Dr. Young is the only physician with a proven ability to cure a stroke, and his services are just what you need to avoid a national disgrace. That's a message from our sponsor, Dr. O.A. Young.
We're also proud to be sponsored by the Scranton Life Insurance Company, which has an incredible offer for our listeners. If you live, you win $1,000. If you die, you win $1,000. Invest $5.50 per month in Scranton Life Insurance Company bonds, and if you live, you will receive $1,000 at the end of 12 years. This is 6% compound interest, equivalent to almost 8% simple interest. If you die at any time during the 12 years, your family, or whoever you wish, will receive $1,000. This insurance feature costs you only 50 cents per month, which is about 1/2 the usual cost. $1,000 cash will come in handy if you live, or for your family if you die. Perhaps you have a small boy or girl whom you would like to send to college or start in life in 12 years hence. It is easier to save a few dollars a month now than to put up $1,000 in big chunks then. Our combination of insurance and investment is the best contract ever offered, affording the biggest return on your savings consistent with safety, and insurance on your life at a smaller cost than you can secure in any other way. Listeners, the Scranton Life Insurance Company is the real deal. I myself just purchased one of their life insurance investment contracts, and not only will I have a nice nest egg waiting for me in 12 years, but it's comforting to know that if anything happens to me, my family will be taken care of.
That's just it, James. This deal is so incredible that I, too, have recently purchased a contract of insurance on James J. Hamilton's life. It's a great long-term investment, and if he happens to die suddenly, I'm in for a huge windfall.
You bought insurance on my life?
That's right, James. I couldn't pass up on 6% compound interest over 12 years. You can't find that anywhere else. Not to mention that I've only put in $5.50 so far and stand to make a profit of $994.50 right now if the worst were to happen.
I don't know how I feel about this.
And now, back to the show. And we're back.
That's right, Stephen Lincoln Douglas firing off a shot in the Dead Presidential Podcast studio in exaltation to celebrate the great deal we got by investing in Scranton Life Insurance Company bonds.
That's just it, James. And now our listeners can exult in the fact that we're about to discuss Woodrow Wilson's post-presidential life. After leaving office, the Wilsons moved into a Washington, D.C. townhouse. President Harding generously assigned Dr. Grayson, who was still in the Navy, to stay in Washington so he could attend to Wilson. Wilson agreed to form a law partnership with Bainbridge Colby, saying he intended to be in the office at least an hour every day, and suggesting that the new firm send out 5,000 engraved notices announcing its formation. Wilson went to the new office one time and never returned. His involvement in the firm consisted mostly in him making Colby refuse to accept any clients where there might be an appearance of using Wilson's political influence. After such refusals cost Colby hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential legal fees, Edith persuaded Wilson to cancel the partnership to free Colby to earn a living.
Yep, former War Secretary Newton Baker said of Wilson, quote, "He seems lonelier, more cut off than ever before. His mind still works with power, but with nothing to work upon, only memories and regrets. He feels himself bitterly misunderstood and unjustly attacked." Joseph Tumulty wrote a memoir praising Wilson, but struggled to find a place for himself in the post-Wilson political world. In 1922, he asked Wilson to let him carry a message from Wilson to the 1922 Jefferson Day dinner in New York, because carrying such a message would bolster Tumulty's own political stature. Wilson refused, and when it subsequently appeared in the papers that a message purporting to be from him was read at the dinner, he publicly disavowed the message, and when an apologetic Tumulty admitted that he was responsible, Wilson cut Tumulty out of his life forever.
Wow.
Quite a pattern in Wilson's life.
Mm-hmm.
His old buddy on the Princeton faculty, cut off. Colonel House.
Cut off. Tumulty, cut off. Wilson is going to see few visitors, and he likes to ride around town for daily drives in his car, spending over 2 years working on a political statement that he saw as a platform for the Democratic Party when it nominated him for president again in 1924. So he's delusional at this point. He provides access to his papers to Ray Stannard Baker and meets frequently with him as Baker prepares a 3-volume biography of Wilson. Wilson writes a few articles for publication, delivers a radio address, and attends Warren Harding's funeral. Spoiler alert. Wilson's health steadily declines, and in his final months, he said to his daughter, quote, "I think it was best, after all, that the United States did not join the League of Nations. Because our entrance into the League at the time I returned from Europe might have been only a personal victory. Now, when the American people join the League, it will be because they are convinced it is the right thing to do, and then will be the only right time for them to do it. Perhaps God knew better than I did after all."
Wow.
Wow, indeed.
Wilson admitting to a little hubris there. even implying that he felt that he knew better than God.
Yeah, that's it.
Harkening back to his old days as a devil worshiper.
Right. And that's going to bring us to his death. Wilson's health collapsed in early 1924, and he suffered kidney failure. He told Dr. Grayson, quote, "I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machinery is broken, I am ready." Those were his last lucid words as he slipped into unconsciousness, though he would repeat the word Edith. Edith and his daughter Margaret were at his side when he died on February 3rd, 1924, at the age of 67. A small private funeral service was held in Washington National Cathedral, attended by a small circle of inmates as well as President Coolidge.
No, that should say intimates.
Inmates. A small circle of inmates came to see him. Yeah. People he'd imprisoned under the Sedition Act.
Yeah. They were allowed briefly to attend Wilson's funeral and then put back to serve out the rest of their 10-year sentences.
Yeah, they were allowed to file past and spit on his coffin. A small private funeral service was held in Washington National Cathedral, attended by a small circle of intimates, as well as President Coolidge. When Henry Cabot Lodge was appointed to a small congressional delegation to attend, Edith wrote him asking him not to come, and he promptly and courteously agreed. Wilson would be buried in the cathedral and is the only president buried within the boundaries of Washington, D.C. Edith would go on to live almost 40 more years and would actually attend JFK's inauguration, riding with Eleanor Roosevelt in the inaugural parade. She died in 1961 at the age of 89 from an overdose of crack cocaine and was interred beside Wilson. She died in 1961 at the age of 89 and was interred beside her husband.
That's right. It's Edith, not Ellen, that gets buried beside Wilson.
That's it. And that's the end of the Woodrow Wilson story. So let's talk about Thomas Woodrow Wilson, his character and his personality. Well, he put himself on par with God, it seemed, and there's a great quote about that we'll get to. But Wilson as a human being, what's he like?
Well, according to the Complete Book of U.S. Presidents, he was an emotionally complex man, craving affection and demanding unquestioned loyalty. He had few intimates and broke sooner or later with most of them. And his most enduring friends were admiring, uncritical women. Wilson describing his own nature as a struggle between his Irish blood, quick, generous, impulsive, passionate, anxious always to help and to sympathize with those in distress, and his Scotch blood, canny, tenacious, cold, and perhaps a little exclusive. He also compared himself to a dormant volcano, placid on the outside and a boiling cauldron within.
Yeah, that's it. He can also be a bit self-deprecatory, at least early on. He penned this little limerick: "For beauty I am not a star, there are others more handsome by far, but my face I don't mind it, for I am behind it, it's the people in front that I jar." Wilson had generally poor health, poor eyesight.
He had probably 4, 5 undiagnosed mini strokes over the years before the final one.
Yeah, so not too great in terms of health. And he overworks himself. He's not doing himself any favors there. Mm-hmm. And there are stories that he liked minstrel shows. Mm-hmm. Of course, he's a product of the South. We've already talked. He's a fucking racist. You know, that's clear. I think we've made it clear. But, like, summing up his character and personality, Woodrow Wilson was a racist. He was a Southern apologist. Mm-hmm. And, like, an early proponent of what would become, like, the lost cause myth. And he liked minstrel shows, and there are accounts that he liked to imitate black voices. Mm-hmm. And he would tell jokes, racist jokes, and he would put on the voice. And supposedly he was really good at it.
A man of many talents.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, that'll bring us on down to book recommendations. I guess first and foremost, let's mention A. Scott Berg's book, Wilson. It's a nice scholarly biography. Perhaps the best one out there.
Yeah, I did listen to that one on audiobook. It was pretty good. You know, it was pretty favorable to Wilson in parts, but also didn't shy away from some of his more uglier aspects.
Yeah. A little bit more objective.
Mm-hmm. I also recommend the aforerecommended American Midnight by Adam Hochschild.
In terms of the visual, and I kind of forgot to mention this in the TR episode, PBS documentaries. Anytime PBS does an American experience documentary on a president, you can rest assured that it's going to be fantastic. The TR one was great, so I'm going to go back and say, you know, for TR recommendations, check that out. And with Wilson, there's a fantastic PBS American experience documentary that will give you a really nice overview of Woodrow Wilson. And, you know, I know for a lot of dullards and laymen, it's easier to watch something as opposed to read or, heaven forbid, even listen to this podcast, which is truly all you need.
Mm-hmm. Yep. This podcast, The Last Word on Woodrow Wilson.
Indeed.
And we like to talk about our visits to presidential homes. We did visit the Wilson townhouse in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and it was pretty cool. There's all kinds of really neat artifacts in there. There's certain things that might appeal to just about anybody, whether it be a signed baseball, whether it be the kitchen setup. Mm-hmm. There's just some neat stuff in there. He's got that translucent globe, and the radio at his desk is set up from his last radio address, which was on Armistice Day, the anniversary, and some pretty cool stuff. It's right across the street from an embassy, I think.
Yeah, it's down in that embassy row type area.
Yeah.
Pretty, cool place to go if you're in Washington, D.C. There's obviously tons of national historical sites there, but don't miss out on the one presidential home you can go to other than the White House.
Yeah. I mean, Arlington, of course, is close. You could go see Kennedy and Taft where they're buried. But, hey, a short jaunt from the Wilson home, check out the Washington National Cathedral.
Yep.
The burial place of Woodrow Wilson.
And Edith Wilson.
Yep. Buried in a church, although they're assuredly roasting in hell. And that's going to bring us to some final words on Woodrow Wilson. We refer to his contemporaries,
including William Howard Taft, who said in 1916, quote, "I regard him as a ruthless hypocrite and as an opportunist who has not convictions that he would not barter at once for votes. He surrenders a conviction previously expressed without the slightest hesitation and never even vouchsafes to the public the arguments upon which he was induced to change his mind."
Well, then you have Herbert Hoover remarking in 1958, "Three qualities of greatness stood out in Woodrow Wilson. He was a man of staunch morals. He was more than just an idealist. He was the personification of the heritage of idealism of the American people. He brought spiritual concepts to the peace table. He was a born crusader."
And Theodore Roosevelt said in 1919, "For heaven's sake, never allude to Wilson as an idealist or an altruist. He is a doctrinaire when he can be so with safety to his personal ambition. He hasn't a touch of idealism in him. His advocacy of the League of Nations no more represents idealism on his part than his advocacy of peace without victory. He is a silly doctrinaire at times and an utterly selfish and cold-blooded politician always.
Ouch. You also had journalist and author Ida M. Tarbell remarking in 1916, Mr. Wilson is a fine, humorous, cultivated American gentleman. Here at last we have a president whose real interest in life centers around the common man, and on whom we can count to serve that man so far as his ability goes.
And we've got Colonel House, Wilson's closest advisor, his second self, who said in 1919, quote, "The president is the most prejudiced man I ever knew and likes but few people."
And we might as well finish it up with some words from the same year, 1919, from French President Georges Clemenceau, who said, quote, "He thinks he is another Jesus Christ come upon the earth to reform men."
Wow.
Hard to sum up Woodrow Wilson.
George Clemenceau, unreformed by
Indeed.
Wilson.
That's
He
just it.
got those reparations. He got Germany under his boot heel. Only to have the tables turn 20 years later.
But we'll get to that another day. As for now, for the Dead Presidents Podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton. And we'll let the constitutionalists play us out with their incredible chart-topping hit, Woodrow Wilson.
Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
The presidential office is not a rosewater affair. This is an office in which a man must put on his war paint. If I cannot retain my moral influence over a man, except by occasionally knocking him down, if that is the only basis upon which he will respect me, then for the sake of his soul, I have got to occasionally knock him down. If you want to make enemies, try to change something. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. We are citizens of the world. The tragedy of our times is that we do not know this. The cure for bad politics is the same as the cure for tuberculosis. It is living in the open.